Imagine a time when the world was very different. No great cities rose from the earth. No written words preserved human thoughts. People wandered with the seasons, carrying everything they owned. But in a land between two mighty rivers, something extraordinary was about to begin. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed from distant mountains down to the sea. Between them lay plains of rich, dark soil. When the rivers flooded each year, they left behind the gift of fertile earth. It was here that people would first discover they could grow their own food. Here they would build the first true cities. Here they would create the first writing. This land would become known as Mesopotamia. The name means between the rivers in ancient Greek. For thousands of years, remarkable people lived along these riverbanks. They learned to tame wild wheat and barley. They built temples that touched the sky. They wrote laws on clay tablets. They told stories of heroes and gods. They watched the stars and mapped the heavens. These were not primitive people living in darkness. They were brilliant inventors, careful observers, and gifted storytellers. Their discoveries would shape every civilization that followed. This is their story, the complete story of humanity's first great civilization. That single ambitious man was born sometime around 1162. The exact year remains lost to history. But the stories of his birth have survived through generations of telling. His name was Temujin. He came into the world clutching something strange in his tiny fist. When the midwives opened his fingers, they found a clot of blood, dark red and solid, like a small stone. The elders gathered around the newborn. They whispered among themselves. This was an omen, they said, a sign of great things to come. Blood in the hand meant power over enemies. It meant victory in battle. It meant a life that would be remembered. Temujin was born into the Borjigin clan. They were respected among the Mongol tribes. Not the most powerful, but honorable. His father was named Yesugei. Yesugei was a capable leader. He commanded the loyalty of several hundred families. The Mongol tribes lived by ancient customs. Strength mattered most. Honor came second. Survival came above everything else. Leaders earned their position through courage and wisdom. They kept it through constant vigilance. Yesugei had many enemies. This was normal among the tribes. Rivalries stretched back generations. Old grudges never truly died on the steppes. They simply waited for the right moment to resurface. When Temujin was still young, his father made an important decision. The boy needed a wife. Marriage created alliances between clans. It secured peace and trading partnerships. Yesugei chose a girl from the Kongarad tribe. The journey to arrange this marriage would change everything. Yesugei travelled with his son to meet the girl's family. The negotiations went well. The match was approved. On the way home, Yesugei stopped to share a meal with some Tatars. The Tatars had been enemies of his clan for years, but steppe hospitality was sacred. Even enemies could share food and drink in peace. Or so Yesugei believed. The Tatars recognized him. They saw their chance for revenge. They mixed poison into his food. Yesugei ate without suspicion. He thanked his hosts and continued his journey home. The poison worked slowly. By the time Yesugei reached his camp, he was gravely ill. He called for his wife and children. He gave them his final instructions. Then he died, leaving his family vulnerable and alone. Temujin was only 9 years old. The death of a clan leader created an immediate crisis. Who would take command? Who would protect the families? Who would lead them to good pastures and safe camps? Yesugei's followers gathered to decide. They looked at the young boy. They saw only a child. Children could not lead warriors into battle. Children could not negotiate with other clans. Children could not make the hard decisions that meant survival or death. One by one, the families packed their belongings. They mounted their horses and rode away. They joined other clans that could offer protection. They abandoned Yesugei's family completely. Within days, everything changed. Temujin's family went from respected leaders to desperate outcasts. They had no herds of animals, no loyal followers, no safe place to make camp. They were alone on the vast steppes. His mother, Holan, gathered her children around her. She looked into their frightened faces. She made them a promise. They would survive this. They would endure whatever came. They would never forget this abandonment. The family learned to live like scavengers. They caught fish in the streams. They dug for roots and wild onions. They hunted small animals with crude traps. Sometimes they went hungry for days. Other tribes looked down on them. Former allies now treated them like beggars. Children who had once played with Temujin now mocked him. Adults who had once bowed to his father now ignored his family completely. But these harsh years taught Temujin important lessons. He learned that loyalty could disappear in an instant. He learned that strength was the only protection against betrayal. He learned that survival required constant vigilance and absolute determination. From this humiliation would arise an unquenchable thirst for unity and order. The abandoned child would grow into the man who demanded absolute loyalty from everyone around him. Life on the steppes without protection was brutally hard. Temujin's family survived each day by their wits alone. They moved constantly to avoid stronger groups who might harm them. The boy grew tall and strong despite the hardships. His eyes held a fierce intelligence. His voice carried natural authority. Even as a teenager, other young men seemed drawn to follow him. But enemies still remembered his father's name. The Taichud clan decided to eliminate any future threat. They captured Temujin when he was about 16 years old. The Taichud put him in a wooden collar called a kangwe. This heavy device locked around his neck and wrists. It made movement difficult and escape nearly impossible. They planned to keep him prisoner until they decided his fate. Temujin endured this humiliation for months, but he watched everything carefully. He studied his captor's routines. He waited for the right moment to act. That moment came during a great feast. The entire tribe was celebrating and drinking fermented mare's milk. Guards became careless. Attention turned to dancing and storytelling. Temujin slipped away into the darkness. The heavy kang made running impossible, but he managed to hide along a riverbank. When morning came and his escape was discovered, search parties scoured the area. A young man from the Taichud found him hiding in the reeds. Instead of raising the alarm, this man made a surprising choice. He helped remove the wooden collar. He pointed toward the safest route to freedom. Then he returned to camp and said nothing. This act of unexpected kindness made a deep impression on Temujin. Years later, when he had the power to reward loyalty, he would remember this man's courage. The escape established Temujin's reputation as someone who could not be easily broken. Stories spread across the steppes. Here was a young man who survived capture, endured imprisonment, and engineered his own freedom. These stories reached the ears of other young warriors. One of them was named Jamuka. He came from a different clan, but he and Temujin had played together as children. When they met again as teenagers, they felt an immediate bond. Jamuka was everything Temujin was not. He came from a powerful family. He commanded respect without having to earn it. He had never known hunger or exile, but he recognized something special in his childhood friend. The two young men performed a ceremony that made them blood brothers. They mixed their blood together and swore eternal friendship. Each promised to support the other through any crisis. This bond was considered sacred among the Mongol people. For a time, their alliance brought Temujin back into the mainstream of tribal politics. Jamuka's protection allowed him to court the girl his father had chosen years earlier. Her name was Berta, and she belonged to the Kongarad tribe. The marriage negotiations went smoothly. Berta's family remembered Yasuge with respect. They agreed to honor the original arrangement. When Temujin came to claim his bride, they welcomed him warmly. Berta brought a valuable gift to the marriage. Her family gave her a sable coat as a wedding present. This was worth more than most families possessed. It could be traded for horses, weapons, or the loyalty of warriors. Temujin took the coat to a powerful leader named Togrul. Togrul had been his father's ally in earlier years. The gift renewed their family connection. Togrul agreed to provide protection and support, but peace never lasted long on the steppes. The Merkid tribe had their own grudge against Temujin's family. Years earlier, Yasuge had stolen a woman from them. Now they wanted revenge. The Merkids struck at dawn. They swept down on Temujin's small camp like a sudden storm. There was no time to organize a defense. Families scattered in panic. Temujin leaped onto his horse and escaped into the forest. But in the confusion he lost track of his wife. When the attack was over and the raiders had gone, Burda was missing. The Merkids had taken her prisoner. They carried her back to their own territory. There, she was forced to become the wife of one of their warriors. This was how steppe warfare worked. Women were prizes to be won and lost. Temujin faced a terrible choice. He could accept this loss and find another wife. Many men would have done exactly that. Or he could risk everything to get her back. He chose to fight, but he could not challenge the Merkids alone. He needed allies. He went to Jamuka and reminded him of their blood brotherhood. He went to Togrul and offered him a share of whatever plunder they might capture. Both men agreed to help. This would be Temujin's first real test as a military leader. The rescue mission succeeded brilliantly. The combined forces struck the Merkid camp at night. They recovered Berta and many other captives. They captured hundreds of horses and other valuable goods. More importantly, Temujin had proven himself as a war leader. Men who had dismissed him as a powerless exile now saw him differently. Here was someone who kept his promises, who fought for what mattered to him, and who rewarded those who helped him. Word of the successful raid spread quickly across the steppes. Young warriors began seeking out Temujin's camp. They came with their horses and their weapons ready to follow him on new adventures. At first, only a few dozen men joined him, but Temujin treated each one as if he were precious. He shared plunder fairly. He listened to their advice. He remembered their names and the names of their families. This was unusual behavior for a Mongol leader. Most commanders kept the best spoils for themselves. They made decisions without consulting anyone. They treated their followers like servants who should be grateful for any attention. Temujin did something revolutionary. He promoted men based on their ability rather than their birth. A talented commoner could rise to high rank in his army. A brave warrior from a weak clan could command troops from stronger clans. This system attracted the best fighters from across the region. Men who had been ignored by traditional leaders found new opportunities with Temujin. They repaid his trust with fierce loyalty. His methods of warfare were equally innovative. Most Mongol battles were chaotic affairs. Warriors charged forward in loose groups, fighting individual duels with their enemies. Victory went to whichever side had more brave men. Temujin organized his forces differently. He divided them into units of specific sizes. Each unit had clear responsibilities. Every man knew exactly what he was supposed to do in battle. When enemies attacked, Temujin's warriors moved like a single creature. They surrounded opponents with coordinated charges. They used feints and retreats to confuse their enemies. They struck where the enemy was weakest, not where he was strongest. These tactics brought victory after victory. Each success brought more followers. Each new ally brought additional horses and weapons. Within a few years, Temujin commanded several thousand warriors. But success also brought new challenges. His growing power made other leaders nervous. Some began to see him as a threat to their own positions. The most worried was his old blood brother Jamuka. Their friendship had grown strained as Temujin's influence expanded. Jamuka came from the traditional nobility. He believed in the old ways of doing things. Temujin's ideas about merit and ability challenged everything Jamuka had been taught. If birth didn't matter, then what advantage did the old noble families have? If anyone could rise to high position, then what made the traditional leaders special? The split between them became public during a hunting expedition. Both men were chosen as leaders of the hunt, but they disagreed about tactics. The argument revealed deeper differences about how the Mongol people should be governed. Jamuka gathered his own supporters. He declared himself a rival claimant to leadership over all the Mongol tribes. The stage was set for a civil war that would determine the future of the steppes. The conflict lasted for several years. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Battles were won and lost on both sides. Alliances shifted constantly as different clans chose sides or switched loyalties. Through it all, Temujin continued to demonstrate the leadership qualities that set him apart. When his followers suffered defeats, he shared their hardships. When they won victories, he shared the credit. When they faced impossible odds, he found ways to inspire them to keep fighting. He also showed a remarkable ability to forgive enemies who submitted to him. Many warriors who had fought against him were welcomed into his army when they changed sides. This mercy was strategic as well as generous. It encouraged other enemies to surrender rather than fight to the death. Gradually, more and more clans declared their support for Temujin. They were impressed by his military success, but they were even more impressed by his fairness and his vision for the future. Unlike other would-be conquerors, Temujin spoke about uniting all the Mongol tribes into a single nation. He promised to end the constant warfare between clans. He offered a future where Mongol energy would be directed outward rather than consumed in internal conflicts. The young man who had once begged for scraps now commanded the loyalty of thousands. His name was spoken with respect in every camp across the steppes. Even his enemies acknowledged his remarkable rise from powerless exile to great leader. But the greatest test still lay ahead. To truly unite the Mongol tribes, he would need more than military victories. He would need the formal recognition of all the clan leaders. He would need to be declared the Khan of all Khans. The final defeat of Jamuka came in 1204. After years of civil war, most of the Mongol tribes had chosen their side. Temujin's forces vastly outnumbered his old blood brother's remaining supporters. When capture became inevitable, Jamuka's own men betrayed him. They bound him with ropes and delivered him to Temujin's camp. They expected to be rewarded for ending the long conflict. Instead, Temujin ordered their execution. Men who would betray their own leader could never be trusted, he declared. Loyalty, even to an enemy, was more valuable than convenient treachery. Jamuka himself was offered a chance to renew their blood brotherhood. He could serve as a trusted advisor and share in governing the united tribes. But Jamuka refused. He said the steppes were not big enough for two suns to shine together. He asked only for an honorable death. Temujin granted this final request. Jamuka was executed without bloodshed, as befitted a man of noble birth. His body was buried with full honors. With the death of his last major rival, Temujin stood as the undisputed leader of most Mongol tribes. But leadership by conquest was not enough. He needed the formal approval of all the traditional authorities. The clans gathered for a great Kurultai in the spring of 1206. This was a traditional assembly where the most important decisions were made. Representatives came from across the steppes. Chiefs and shamans, warriors and wise women all had voices in the proceedings. The debates lasted for days. Some speakers praised Temujin's military genius and his fair treatment of former enemies. Others worried about concentrating so much power in the hands of one man. But the momentum was clearly in Temujin's favour. His supporters vastly outnumbered his critics. When the formal vote was taken, it was nearly unanimous. On that momentous day, the assembled tribes declared Temujin to be Genghis Khan. The title meant universal ruler, or king of the ocean. It indicated authority over all the peoples of the known world. Genghis Khan immediately began implementing revolutionary changes. He abolished the old system of hereditary positions. Instead, he created a new structure based entirely on merit and ability. His army was organized in decimal units. Every 10 men had a leader, every 100 men had a captain, every 1,000 men had a commander, every 10,000 men had a general. This system made communication efficient and command responsibility clear, but the changes went far beyond military organization. Genghis Khan declared that all Mongols were now members of a single nation. The old tribal divisions still existed, but they were less important than the new national identity. He established laws that applied to everyone equally. Rich and poor, noble and commoner, all were subject to the same rules. These laws covered everything from military discipline to property rights to religious practice. Most remarkably, he declared that all religions were worthy of respect. Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and traditional shamans could all practice their faiths freely. This was almost unheard of in the medieval world. The new Khan also reformed the traditional marriage customs. He limited the number of wives a man could have based on his ability to support them. He gave women legal protections against abandonment and abuse. These changes created enthusiasm among many groups that had been powerless under the old system. Common soldiers saw opportunities for advancement. Women gained rights they had never enjoyed. Religious minorities found protection from persecution. But Genghis Khan's vision extended far beyond reforming Mongol society. He spoke of conquering lands beyond the steppes. He promised his followers wealth and glory through campaigns against the settled civilizations that surrounded them. The Chinese kingdoms to the south were rich but divided. The Islamic empires to the west were prosperous but distant from each other. The time seemed right for a united Mongol nation to test its strength against these tempting targets. On this day, the scattered tribes became a nation, and a nation became an empire. The Kurultai of 1206 marked the end of one chapter in Mongol history and the beginning of another. The man who had been born clutching blood in his fist had fulfilled the ancient prophecy. He now held power over enemies across vast distances. His name would be remembered as long as stories were told around campfires. But Genghis Khan was just beginning to dream of what was possible. The Great Assembly had made Genghis Khan the supreme ruler of the Mongol tribes, but his authority was still limited to those who had attended the Kurultai. Across the vast steppes, other peoples remained independent. Some had never heard his name, others knew of him but refused to submit. The new Khan understood that half measures would not work. A few independent tribes could inspire others to rebellion. They could provide refuge for his enemies. They could disrupt the unity he had worked so hard to create. He decided that every person on the steppes must choose. They could join his growing nation voluntarily, or they could be conquered and forced to join. But remaining independent was no longer an option. The Taichud clan was among the first to feel his wrath. These were the people who had once held him prisoner in a wooden collar. They had humiliated him when he was powerless. Now he was powerful, and he remembered every detail of that humiliation. Genghis Khan's army surrounded their camps on a cold morning in early spring. The Taichud warriors tried to fight, but they were vastly outnumbered. Their resistance collapsed within hours. The Khan faced a crucial decision about what to do with his former captors. His followers expected him to order mass executions. Revenge was a sacred duty among the Mongol people. Blood demanded blood, but Genghis Khan chose a different path. He ordered the death of the Taichud leaders who had ordered his imprisonment, but he spared the common warriors and their families. He even freed the man who had helped him escape years earlier. This combination of justice and mercy sent a clear message across the steppes. Resistance would be punished severely, but surrender would be rewarded with fair treatment. Enemy warriors could find honor serving in his army. The Naiman tribe presented a much greater challenge. They controlled vast territories in the western regions. Their Khan was named Taiyang, and he commanded tens of thousands of warriors. He had never acknowledged Genghis Khan's authority. Taiyang made the mistake of believing that numbers alone would bring victory. He gathered his entire army for a single decisive battle. He planned to crush the upstart Mongol leader through sheer overwhelming force. Genghis Khan accepted the challenge, but he fought the battle on his own terms. Instead of meeting the Naiman army head-on, he used the tactics that had brought him success for years. He divided his forces into multiple columns. Each column attacked from a different direction. The Naiman army found itself surrounded and confused. Their numerical advantage became meaningless when they could not coordinate their movements. The battle lasted all day. By evening, Taiyang was dead and his army was scattered. Thousands of Naiman warriors lay dead on the battlefield. The survivors faced the same choice that other defeated enemies had faced. Most chose to submit. They were welcomed into Genghis Khan's army and treated as equals with the original Mongol warriors. Their horses and weapons were distributed fairly among all the troops, but integration required more than just mixing different peoples together. Genghis Khan needed a military system that could absorb new recruits quickly and efficiently. He needed an organization that could grow without losing effectiveness. The solution was his revolutionary decimal system. Every unit was built around multiples of 10. The smallest unit, called an arban, contained 10 men. 10 arbans formed a jagun of 100 men. 10 jaguns formed a minghan of 1,000 men. 10 minghans formed a tumen of 10,000 men. This system made it easy to add new warriors to existing units. It created clear chains of command that everyone could understand. It allowed for rapid communication of orders from the highest levels down to individual soldiers. More importantly, the decimal system broke down old tribal loyalties. Men from different clans were mixed together in the same units. Former enemies fought side by side. Shared victories created new bonds that were stronger than old divisions. The system also created opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. A common herder could rise to command a jagun if he showed courage and intelligence. A captured enemy could earn promotion to lead his former captors if he proved his loyalty. Each campaign brought new challenges and new solutions. Some tribes submitted without fighting when they saw the size of his army. Others chose to resist to the death rather than accept foreign rule. Genghis Khan developed different strategies for different situations. Tribes that surrendered quickly were treated generously. Their leaders kept their positions under Mongol oversight. Their people kept their customs and their property. But tribes that chose prolonged resistance faced complete destruction. Their leaders were executed publicly. Their warriors were scattered among different units. Their traditional ways of life were deliberately eliminated. This policy of calculated mercy and strategic brutality proved remarkably effective. Most tribes chose surrender over destruction. The few that chose to fight were eliminated so thoroughly that they served as examples to discourage other resistance. By 1207, virtually every tribe on the steppes had acknowledged Genghis Khan's authority. Some had joined willingly. Others had been conquered. But all were now part of a single, unified nation. The transformation was remarkable. Just a generation earlier, these lands had been divided among hundreds of independent clans. Constant warfare had kept them weak and poor. Now they were united under a single banner. Where once 100 tribes had warred, now a single people looked outward. Their energy was no longer consumed by internal conflicts. Their warriors were no longer scattered among countless petty leaders. Their resources were no longer wasted on meaningless feuds. Genghis Khan commanded an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was disciplined but flexible. It was unified but diverse. It was large enough to challenge the greatest powers of the age. The question now was where to use this unprecedented force. The steppes had been conquered, but beyond the grasslands lay wealthy kingdoms with rich cities and vast populations. These settled peoples had always looked down on the nomads as primitive barbarians. Soon they would learn how wrong they had been. South of Mongolia lay a kingdom that controlled some of the most valuable trade routes in Asia. The Western Xia ruled over the corridor between China and Central Asia. Silk, spices, and precious metals passed through their territory on the way to distant markets. The Xia kings had grown wealthy by taxing this trade. They used their profits to build strong fortresses and hire large armies. They considered themselves the equals of the great Chinese dynasties to the east, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the threat growing in the northern steppes. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding tribute, the Xia king laughed at the idea of paying anything to nomadic barbarians. This contempt would cost him everything. Genghis Khan saw the Western Xia campaign as more than just revenge for an insult. It would be a testing ground for his army's ability to fight beyond the steppes. It would teach his warriors how to capture fortified cities. It would provide experience in governing settled peoples. The invasion began in 1205 with a series of lightning raids. Mongol cavalry swept across the border and struck isolated settlements. They captured livestock and supplies, then disappeared back into the desert before defenders could respond. These attacks served multiple purposes. They provided valuable intelligence about Xia military capabilities. They disrupted trade and reduced the kingdom's income. Most importantly, they forced the enemy to spread their forces across a vast frontier. The Mongols learned that fighting in this region was very different from warfare on the steppes. Cities were protected by high walls made of brick and stone. These walls could not be broken by cavalry charges or archery attacks, but Genghis Khan was always eager to learn new techniques. His army captured Chinese engineers who had been working for the Xia. Under threat of death, these men agreed to teach the Mongols about siege warfare. They showed how to build catapults that could hurl stones at city walls. They demonstrated the use of siege towers that allowed attackers to climb over fortifications. They explained how to dig tunnels that could collapse sections of walls. The Mongol army became a mobile school of military engineering. Warriors who had never seen a city larger than a market town learned to operate complex siege machines. Herders who had lived their entire lives in felt tents learned to attack stone fortresses. The first major test came at the city of Wulahai in 1209. This fortress controlled a key mountain pass on the Silk Road. Its capture would give the Mongols access to the heart of Xia territory. The siege lasted for months. The Mongols surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements. They used their new siege weapons to pound the walls day and night. They dug tunnels to undermine the foundations. More importantly, they demonstrated the patience needed for siege warfare. Steppe battles were usually decided in a few hours. Capturing fortified cities required weeks or months of steady pressure. When Wulahai finally fell, the Mongols had learned valuable lessons. They now understood how to coordinate different types of attacks. They knew how to maintain morale during long sieges. They had proven that nomad armies could adapt to any type of warfare. The capture of Wulahai opened the floodgates. Other Xia cities surrendered quickly rather than endure similar sieges. The Mongol army advanced rapidly through the kingdom's heartland. By 1210, Mongol forces had reached the Xia capital city. The king found himself trapped behind walls that had once seemed impregnable. His armies had been scattered or destroyed. His treasury was empty. His people were starving. He had no choice but to negotiate surrender. The terms were harsh but not impossible. The Western Xia would become a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. They would pay annual tribute in gold, silk, and other valuable goods. They would provide troops for future Mongol campaigns. In return, the Xia king could keep his throne. His people could maintain their customs and religion. Their cities would not be destroyed or their populations enslaved. This arrangement became a model for future Mongol conquests. Complete destruction was reserved for enemies who refused to surrender. Kingdoms that submitted could expect to survive under new management. The Western Xia campaign had accomplished everything Genghis Khan had hoped. His army had gained experience in siege warfare and urban combat. His engineers had mastered new technologies and techniques. His commanders had learned to govern settled populations. Most importantly, the campaign had proven that the Mongol army could succeed beyond the steppes. Walls could be overcome with patience and proper equipment. Cities could be taken with the right combination of force and strategy. The Mongols learned that walls could be overcome and cities could be taken. This knowledge would serve them well in the greater conquest that lay ahead. The success against Western Xia caught the attention of much larger powers. To the east lay the Jin dynasty, which ruled over northern China and parts of Korea. The Jin controlled some of the richest and most populous territories in the world. Their capital at Beijing was home to over 1 million people. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their treasury contained wealth beyond anything the Mongols had ever imagined. They considered themselves the inheritors of thousands of years of Chinese civilization. When Jin ambassadors arrived at Genghis Khan's court in 1211, they expected the usual tribute and submission that Chinese dynasties had always received from barbarian neighbors. They demanded that the new Mongol Khan bow down and acknowledge Jin superiority. Genghis Khan's response was swift and decisive. He spat on the ground and declared that he would bow to no man on earth. The Jin ambassadors were sent home with a message that war would begin immediately. This was the most ambitious campaign the Mongols had ever attempted. The Jin dynasty was not a small border kingdom like Western Xia. It was a major power with sophisticated military technology and vast resources. But Genghis Khan had advantages that his enemies did not fully understand. His army was now completely unified and disciplined. His warriors had gained valuable experience in recent campaigns. His intelligence network provided detailed information about enemy strengths and weaknesses. The invasion began with the same tactics that had worked against Western Xia. Fast-moving cavalry columns struck across a broad front. They avoided major fortified cities and concentrated on disrupting communications and supply lines. The Jin armies were poorly prepared for this type of warfare. They were organized to fight set battles between large formations. They expected enemies to attack predictable targets in conventional ways. They had no effective response to an enemy that struck everywhere and nowhere. Within months, Mongol forces had overrun most of the Jin territory north of Beijing. They captured enormous quantities of supplies and equipment. They recruited thousands of Chinese engineers and craftsmen who brought new skills to the Mongol army. But the real prize was Beijing itself. This city was unlike anything the Mongols had ever encountered. It was surrounded by walls 40 feet high and 8 feet thick. It contained palaces, temples, markets, and residential districts that housed over 1 million people. The siege of Beijing began in 1214 and lasted for over a year. This was siege warfare on a scale that dwarfed anything the Mongols had previously attempted. They had to surround a city that was larger than many entire kingdoms. The logistical challenges were enormous. Feeding and supplying a Mongol army for months required careful planning and organization. Keeping warriors motivated during a long siege required constant attention from their leaders. But the Mongols adapted to these challenges with their usual flexibility. They learned to coordinate attacks involving hundreds of siege engines simultaneously. They mastered the art of psychological warfare against urban populations. They developed new techniques for storming heavily fortified positions. More importantly, they began to understand the complexities of governing large settled populations. Beijing contained more people than all the Mongol tribes combined. These people had sophisticated systems of law, administration, and commerce that were completely foreign to nomadic traditions. Genghis Khan made the pragmatic decision to preserve much of the existing Chinese governmental structure. Jin officials who surrendered were allowed to keep their positions under Mongol supervision. Chinese laws and customs were maintained where they did not conflict with Mongol interests. This policy proved remarkably successful. The transition from Jin to Mongol rule was smoother than anyone had expected. Chinese farmers continued to grow crops. Chinese merchants continued to operate their businesses. Chinese craftsmen continued to produce the goods that made the region wealthy. But the Mongols also imposed their own values and priorities. The rigid Chinese social hierarchy was replaced with a merit-based system. Religious tolerance was enforced throughout the territory. Military service became a path to advancement for talented individuals regardless of their background. The cultural shock worked both ways. Chinese officials were amazed by Mongol military efficiency and organizational skills. They had assumed that nomads were primitive and disorganized. Instead, they found themselves serving under leaders who were often more competent than their previous rulers. Mongol warriors were equally amazed by Chinese civilization. They had never seen cities with paved streets and running water. They had never encountered libraries containing thousands of books. They had never imagined that people could create such beautiful art and architecture. This mutual amazement led to unprecedented cultural exchange. Chinese engineers taught Mongols about advanced siege techniques. Mongol generals taught Chinese officers about cavalry tactics and rapid movement. Both sides learned from each other in ways that benefited everyone. The fall of Beijing in 1215 marked a turning point in world history. For the first time, nomad horsemen ruled over millions of farmers. A people who had never lived in permanent settlements now governed some of the world's greatest cities. The Jin dynasty wars proved that the Mongol Empire could absorb and govern sophisticated civilizations. They demonstrated that nomadic military superiority could be combined with settled administrative expertise. They showed that cultural differences could be bridged through mutual respect and practical cooperation. but they also revealed new challenges that would shape the future of the empire. How could Mongol traditions be preserved while ruling over diverse populations? How could nomadic values be balanced with the needs of agricultural societies? How could a unified empire be maintained across such vast distances and cultural differences? These questions would become increasingly important as Mongol ambitions expanded beyond China toward even greater prizes in the West. The lessons learned in the Jin dynasty wars would be tested on an even larger scale in the campaigns that followed. While Mongol armies were conquering northern China, events far to the west were setting the stage for an even greater conflict. Beyond the deserts of Central Asia lay the Khwarezmid Empire, one of the most powerful Muslim states of the time. The Khwarezmid Shah ruled over territories that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. His empire included some of the world's most magnificent cities: Bukhara, Samarkand, Baghdad, and Isfahan. These were centers of learning, art, and commerce that had flourished for centuries. Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad had no reason to fear distant nomads from Mongolia. His empire was wealthy and well defended. His armies were experienced and well equipped. His cities were protected by strong fortifications and loyal populations. The first contact between the two empires seemed promising for peaceful relations. Genghis Khan sent a trade mission to Khwarezm in 1218. He carried a message declaring that he wished to establish friendly commercial relationships with his beloved son, the Shah. The trade mission consisted of several hundred merchants carrying valuable goods from China and Mongolia. They represented the kind of peaceful exchange that had made the Silk Road profitable for centuries. Their leader was a Mongol general named Ukana, who served as both diplomat and merchant. The mission arrived at the border city of Otrar, which was governed by a Khwarezmid official named Inalchuk. This man was suspicious of the Mongol traders. He believed they were actually spies sent to gather intelligence about Khwarezmid defences. His suspicions were not entirely wrong. Some members of the mission were indeed gathering information about military capabilities and political conditions. This was normal practice for any diplomatic mission of the time. All kingdoms used trade delegations to collect intelligence about potential allies or enemies. But Inalchuk's response was far beyond what the situation warranted. Instead of simply expelling suspicious individuals, he ordered the execution of the entire trade mission. Nearly 500 merchants and their guards were killed. Their valuable goods were confiscated. When news of the massacre reached Genghis Khan, he was faced with a crucial decision. He could treat this as a local incident caused by an overzealous official. He could demand compensation and the punishment of those responsible, or he could treat it as an act of war requiring total retaliation. Before making any final decision, he sent another embassy to Shah Muhammad. This mission carried a clear message: surrender the official responsible for the massacre or face the consequences of war with the Mongol Empire. The Shah's response sealed the fate of his empire. Instead of apologizing or offering compensation, he killed the chief ambassador and sent the others back with their beards shaved off. This was considered the ultimate insult in both Mongol and Muslim cultures. Genghis Khan's fury at this second insult was beyond anything his followers had ever witnessed. He had offered the Shah opportunities to avoid conflict. He had shown more patience than was typical for Mongol diplomacy. Now he felt that his honor and the honor of his empire demanded complete revenge. The decision for war was unanimous among Mongol leaders, but this would be unlike any previous campaign. The Khwarezmid Empire was thousands of miles away across some of the world's harshest deserts. Reaching it would require logistical planning on an unprecedented scale. Genghis Khan spent months preparing for the campaign. He gathered intelligence from merchants and travelers who knew the routes to Khwarezm. He stockpiled supplies and equipment for a journey that might last years. He reorganized his army to operate across vast distances without losing effectiveness. The march west began in 1219 with an army of over 150,000 warriors. This force included not only Mongol cavalry, but also Chinese engineers, Muslim administrators, and troops from all the conquered territories. It was truly an international army united under Mongol leadership. The journey across Central Asia took several months. The army had to cross waterless deserts, navigate mountain passes, and find supplies in regions where few people lived. It was a logistical achievement that proved the Mongol Empire's remarkable organizational capabilities. When the Mongol army finally appeared on the borders of Khwarezm, Shah Muhammad was completely unprepared. He had not believed that any force could cross the Central Asian deserts. He had made no preparations to defend against an invasion from the east. The Mongol strategy was devastatingly effective. Instead of concentrating on a single target, they divided into multiple armies that struck across the entire empire simultaneously. No city could be reinforced because every city was under attack. The siege of Bukhara demonstrated the new level of destructiveness that Mongol warfare had reached. When the city's defenders refused to surrender, Genghis Khan ordered its complete destruction. The entire population was either killed or enslaved. The city's famous libraries were burned. Its magnificent buildings were reduced to rubble. Samarkand suffered a similar fate despite being one of the world's most beautiful cities. When its walls were breached, Mongol warriors poured through the streets, killing everyone they encountered. Craftsmen and scholars who had created works of art were slaughtered alongside common soldiers. The systematic destruction of Khwarezmid cities served a strategic purpose beyond mere revenge. Each city that was completely destroyed sent a message to other cities about the consequences of resistance. Many places chose to surrender immediately rather than face total annihilation. Urgench, the Khwarezmid capital, held out for several months before falling to a massive siege. Its capture marked the effective end of the empire. Shah Muhammad had fled westward and died in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea. The Mongol conquest of Khwarezm was remarkable for its speed and completeness. An empire that had taken centuries to build was destroyed in less than 3 years. Cities that had been centres of civilization for 1,000 years were erased from the map. The human cost was enormous. Entire populations were eliminated. Irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for centuries were destroyed. Trade routes that had connected east and west were disrupted for generations. Never had such destruction been seen. Entire civilizations erased in a single generation. The Mongol conquest of Khwarezm established their reputation as the most fearsome military force in the world. It also demonstrated their willingness to use complete destruction as a tool of policy. But the campaign also revealed the emerging character of the Mongol Empire. This was no longer simply a confederation of nomadic tribes seeking plunder. It had become a world power capable of projecting force across vast distances and governing diverse populations. The pursuit of the Khwarezmid Empire had taken Mongol armies farther from home than they had ever travelled. It had tested their ability to maintain unity and discipline across thousands of miles. It had proven that no kingdom, however wealthy or powerful, was safe from Mongol ambitions. The stage was now set for even greater conquests that would carry the Mongol Empire to the very borders of Europe and beyond. The destruction of the Khwarezmid Empire sent shockwaves across the known world. News of entire cities being erased travelled along trade routes faster than armies could march. Merchants carried stories of unprecedented devastation. Refugees spoke of horrors beyond imagination. This reputation for total destruction became one of Genghis Khan's most powerful weapons. Many cities surrendered immediately when Mongol armies appeared on the horizon. Their leaders had heard what happened to those who chose resistance. They preferred submission to annihilation. The psychological impact was exactly what Genghis Khan had intended. Why waste time and soldiers besieging every city when fear could open the gates? Why fight unnecessary battles when terror could win victories without bloodshed? But terror alone could not govern an empire. As Mongol territories expanded, Genghis Khan faced new challenges that had nothing to do with warfare. How do you rule millions of farmers when your people are nomadic herders? How do you govern ancient cities when your experience is with portable camps? The solution was to extend the decimal system that had worked so well for military organization. Every aspect of imperial administration was built around units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Villages were grouped into units of 10 households. Each group had a leader responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining order. 10 village groups formed a larger administrative unit with its own officials. This pattern continued upward to the highest levels of government. The system had several advantages. It was easy to understand and implement. It created clear lines of authority and responsibility. It allowed rapid communication between different levels of administration. Most importantly, it could be applied to any population regardless of their previous governmental structure. But Genghis Khan's administrative revolution went far beyond organizational charts. He implemented policies that were radical for their time. Religious tolerance was enforced throughout the empire. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and traditional believers could all practice their faiths freely. This policy served practical purposes as well as moral ones. Religious persecution created unnecessary conflicts that drained imperial resources. Religious tolerance encouraged cooperation from conquered populations. It also allowed the Mongols to recruit talented administrators regardless of their beliefs. The principle of meritocracy was extended throughout the imperial government. Positions were filled based on ability rather than birth, wealth, or connections. A talented Chinese scholar could advise on policy. A skilled Persian engineer could design fortifications. A capable Arab merchant could manage trade relationships. This system attracted the best minds from across the known world. Men who had been ignored by their own societies found opportunities under Mongol rule. They repaid this trust with innovations that strengthened the entire empire. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, became the nervous system of imperial administration. Relay stations were established every 25 miles along major routes. Fresh horses and supplies were always available for official messengers. Important communications could travel from China to Central Asia in weeks rather than months. This communication network allowed unprecedented coordination across vast distances. Local officials could receive instructions from the capital quickly. Problems could be reported and solutions implemented without long delays. The empire truly functioned as a single unit despite its enormous size. Genghis Khan also preserved the best aspects of conquered civilizations. Chinese engineers continued to build sophisticated machines. Persian artists continued to create beautiful works. Arab scholars continued to study mathematics and astronomy. The empire became richer through this cultural preservation, but everything was now directed toward common goals rather than scattered local interests. Chinese engineering served Mongol military needs. Persian art celebrated Mongol victories. Arab scholarship contributed to Mongol administration. The legal system was reformed to create consistency across the empire. Local customs were preserved where they did not conflict with imperial law, but certain crimes were punished the same way everywhere. Theft, murder, and treason carried identical penalties whether committed in Mongolia or China. Trade regulations were standardized to encourage commerce. Weights and measures were made uniform. Currency systems were simplified. Safe passage was guaranteed for merchants who paid their taxes and obeyed imperial laws. These reforms created prosperity that benefited everyone. Farmers could sell their crops in distant markets. Craftsmen could access new materials and techniques. Merchants could operate across vast territories without dealing with different legal systems. Women gained rights that were unusual for the time period. They could own property independently. They could initiate divorce proceedings. They could participate in certain business activities. These policies reflected traditional Mongol customs but were revolutionary in many conquered territories. Education was encouraged throughout the empire. Schools were established in major cities. Literacy programs were expanded beyond the traditional ruling classes. Knowledge was seen as a resource that made the empire stronger. The military remained the foundation of imperial power, but it was no longer purely destructive. Mongol armies built roads and bridges. They dug canals and irrigation systems. They protected trade routes and maintained order in distant provinces. Genghis Khan ruled not just through fear, but through revolutionary ideas of governance. His empire offered opportunities, protection, and prosperity to those who accepted Mongol authority. It provided a vision of unity, that transcended traditional boundaries of tribe, religion, and culture. This combination of terror and administration proved remarkably effective. Conquered peoples found that Mongol rule was often better than what they had experienced before. Rebellions became rare because most people had more to gain from cooperation than from resistance. The man who had once been in exile surviving on scraps and roots had become the architect of a new form of global civilization. His innovations in government would influence empires and kingdoms for centuries to come. While Genghis Khan was organizing his new empire, two of his most capable generals were pursuing a mission that would have profound consequences for world history. Subutai and Jebi had been ordered to capture Shah Muhammad, who had fled westward after the fall of his empire. The Shah had proven impossible to pin down. He moved constantly, staying just ahead of his pursuers. He hoped the distance would eventually discourage the Mongol generals from continuing their chase. He underestimated their determination and their abilities. Subutai was perhaps the greatest military strategist in Mongol history. He understood warfare on a scale that amazed even other Mongol commanders. He could coordinate multiple armies across thousands of miles. He could plan campaigns that lasted for years and anticipated every possible complication. Jebi was known as the Arrow for his speed and precision in battle. He had originally been an enemy warrior who had wounded Genghis Khan in combat. But when he was captured, he acknowledged his deed openly and asked to serve the man he had failed to kill. His honesty earned him a place among the Khan's most trusted generals. Together, these two commanders represented the best of Mongol military leadership. They combined strategic brilliance with tactical flexibility. They could adapt to any environment or enemy. They never accepted defeat as long as alternatives existed. Their pursuit of Shah Muhammad had taken them far beyond the borders of the former Khwarezmid Empire. They had crossed the Caucasus Mountains and entered the lands north of the Black Sea. These were territories that no Mongol had ever seen before. The landscape was different from anything in their previous experience. Instead of deserts and steppes, they found dense forests and broad rivers. Instead of scattered nomadic tribes, they encountered settled kingdoms with stone castles and walled towns. When Shah Muhammad finally died of illness on a Caspian Sea island in 1220, the two generals faced an important decision. They could return home immediately with news of their success, or they could use this opportunity to explore the unknown lands that lay before them. They chose exploration. Their decision would introduce Europe to the Mongol Empire several years before anyone expected such contact. The Mongol army that entered European territory consisted of only about 20,000 warriors. This was a tiny force compared to the hundreds of thousands that had conquered Khwarezm, but it was led by two of the most capable commanders in the world, and every warrior was a veteran of multiple campaigns. Their first encounters with European armies were almost comically one-sided. European knights fought as individual heroes rather than coordinated units. They charged directly at their enemies without regard for tactics or strategy. They considered retreat dishonourable even when it would save lives. These methods had worked well enough in conflicts between European kingdoms, but they were completely ineffective against Mongol tactics. The Europeans found themselves facing enemies who refused to stand and fight in the traditional manner. Instead, the Mongols used the same methods that had conquered much larger armies in Asia. They surrounded their opponents with superior mobility. They used feigned retreats to lure knights into ambushes. They shot arrows from distances where European weapons could not reach them. The Battle of Kalka River in 1223 demonstrated the enormous gap between European and Mongol military capabilities. A coalition of Russian princes had assembled a large army to drive out the mysterious invaders. They outnumbered the Mongols by at least 2-1. The battle began with a typical European cavalry charge. Thousands of armoured knights thundered across the battlefield toward the Mongol lines. They expected their enemies to either flee in terror or stand their ground for hand-to-hand combat. Instead, the Mongols scattered like leaves before the wind. They reformed at safe distances and began shooting arrows at the confused Europeans. When the knights tried to pursue them, they scattered again. This process continued for hours under the scorching sun. European horses, bred for short bursts of speed, began to tire quickly. Their heavy armour became unbearably hot. Their formations became disorganised as different units tried to chase different groups of enemies. The Mongols, meanwhile, fought exactly as they had been trained since childhood. They used fresh horses from their spare mounts. They coordinated their movements through horn signals and banner positions. They never allowed themselves to be trapped or surrounded. When the European army was completely exhausted and disorganised, Subutai gave the signal for the final attack. The scattered Mongol units suddenly converged from all directions. The Russians found themselves surrounded by enemies who had seemed to be fleeing moments before. The slaughter that followed was complete and merciless. Most of the Russian army was destroyed. Many princes were killed or captured. Those who escaped carried stories of an enemy unlike anything Europe had ever faced. But the two Mongol generals were not interested in conquest at this time. They had accomplished their reconnaissance mission beyond all expectations. They had learned that European armies were poorly organized and tactically primitive. They had mapped routes that future invasions could follow. More importantly, they had demonstrated that no distance was too great for Mongol armies to travel. European kingdoms that thought themselves safe behind mountains and forests had been reached and defeated by a small advance force. The psychological impact was enormous. Stories of the mysterious Eastern warriors spread throughout Europe. Church leaders proclaimed that these might be the armies of the Antichrist, mentioned in biblical prophecies. Scholars debated whether such effective warriors could possibly be human, but European ignorance about the Mongol Empire remained almost complete. Most people assumed that the invaders were just another nomadic tribe that could be dealt with through traditional methods. They had no understanding of the vast organised state that lay behind this small reconnaissance force. Subutai and Jebe returned home with detailed intelligence about European geography, military capabilities, and political divisions. They reported that conquest would be relatively easy if sufficient forces were committed to the task. Their maps showed the locations of major cities and fortifications. Their reports described the strengths and weaknesses of different European armies. Their recommendations outlined the best routes for large-scale invasion. This information would prove invaluable when the Mongol Empire was ready to undertake serious European conquests. But for now, Genghis Khan was satisfied with the knowledge that his reach extended even to these distant lands. Two generals with 20,000 men had struck terror into kingdoms that thought themselves invulnerable. They had proven that Mongol power could project itself anywhere in the known world. They had opened a door that future generations would walk through with much larger armies. The European reconnaissance had revealed a continent that was wealthy but militarily weak. It was divided into competing kingdoms that rarely cooperated effectively. It was defended by armies that relied on obsolete tactics and individual heroism rather than disciplined organization. When the time came for serious conquest, the Mongols would be ready. The military success of the Mongol Empire was built upon a foundation that most outsiders never understood. The tactics that conquered kingdoms had been developed through generations of hunting on the steppes. What seemed like revolutionary warfare to settled peoples was simply an extension of skills that every Mongol learned as a child. The Great Hunt, known as the Nurj, was far more than just a method for catching animals. It was a massive military exercise that involved thousands of participants. It taught coordination, discipline, and strategic thinking on a scale that prepared warriors for the largest battles. A typical Nurj began with scouts being sent out to identify suitable hunting grounds. They located areas where large numbers of animals had gathered. They mapped the terrain and identified natural barriers that could be used to trap prey. They reported back on weather conditions and other factors that might affect the hunt. Based on this intelligence, commanders divided their forces into multiple groups. Each group had specific responsibilities and assigned positions. Some units formed the driving line that would push animals toward the trap. Others positioned themselves along escape routes. Still others waited at the final killing ground. The actual hunt could cover hundreds of square miles and last for several days. Thousands of riders moved in perfect coordination across vast distances. They communicated through horn signals, smoke signals, and banner positions. They maintained their formations despite travelling through forests, across rivers, and over mountains. The animals being hunted had no chance to escape because every possible exit was blocked by Mongol warriors. Deer, wolves, bears, and wild boar were all driven toward a central location where they could be killed efficiently. Nothing was allowed to break through the human net that surrounded them. This same coordination was applied to human enemies during military campaigns. Mongol armies surrounded their opponents just as hunting parties surrounded wild animals. They used the same signals and formations. They applied the same relentless pressure that left no possibility of escape. The Nerj also taught patience and discipline. Hunters might spend days in position waiting for the right moment to act. They had to remain quiet and motionless for hours at a time. They had to trust that other units were performing their assigned roles, even when those units were not visible. These skills translated directly to siege warfare. Mongol armies could maintain blockades for months without losing effectiveness. They could coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. They could wait for the perfect moment to strike while keeping constant pressure on their enemies. Communication systems developed for hunting became the foundation of imperial administration. The Yam postal network used the same relay principles that allowed hunting parties to coordinate across vast distances. Fresh horses and supplies were stationed at regular intervals. Messages could be transmitted quickly and reliably over thousands of miles. The postal stations were more than just places to change horses. They served as intelligence-gathering points where information from different regions could be collected and analyzed. They provided secure storage for supplies and equipment. They offered shelter and protection for travelling officials and merchants. This communication network allowed the Mongol Empire to function as a single coordinated unit despite its enormous size. Orders from the Khan could reach distant provinces within weeks. Local governors could report problems and receive instructions quickly. Military campaigns could be coordinated across multiple theatres simultaneously. The integration of Chinese siege technology with traditional Mongol mobility created a military force unlike anything the world had ever seen. Chinese engineers taught Mongol armies how to build and operate complex siege machines. Mongol generals taught Chinese technicians how to make their equipment more portable and flexible. Catapults that had once been permanent installations became mobile weapons that could be assembled quickly at any siege site. Siege towers were redesigned to be lighter and easier to transport. Tunneling techniques were adapted for armies that might need to move quickly to new targets. The combination proved devastatingly effective. Mongol armies could appear suddenly outside enemy cities with full siege capabilities. They could breach walls that had been considered impregnable. They could capture fortifications that previous armies would have needed months or years to reduce. But the greatest innovation was the application of hunting psychology to human warfare. In the Great Hunt, animals were driven to panic by the constant pressure from all directions. They made desperate attempts to escape that only led them deeper into the trap. They exhausted themselves through futile struggles against an inescapable net. Human armies reacted in remarkably similar ways when surrounded by Mongol forces. They made desperate sorties that accomplished nothing except weakening their own defences. They wasted resources on futile attempts to break through the encirclement. They demoralized themselves by fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. The Mongol commanders understood this psychology perfectly. They applied just enough pressure to keep their enemies off balance without driving them to desperate last stands. They offered opportunities for surrender at carefully chosen moments. They used psychological manipulation as skillfully as they used arrows and swords. Training exercises that simulated both hunting and warfare were conducted regularly throughout the empire. Every warrior practiced the coordination and communication skills that made large-scale operations possible. Every unit rehearsed the formations and movements that would be used in actual combat. These exercises served multiple purposes beyond military training. They reinforced social bonds between warriors from different backgrounds. They provided opportunities for commanders to evaluate and promote talented individuals. They maintained the physical fitness and skills that were essential for nomadic life. The Great Hunt also served as a massive logistical operation that taught skills essential for long-distance campaigning. Feeding thousands of people for days or weeks required careful planning and resource management. Moving large groups efficiently across difficult terrain required organizational expertise that applied directly to military operations. War became art, and conquest became science. The Mongol Empire had systematized military success in ways that previous civilizations had never achieved. They had turned the instinctive skills of nomadic hunters into the foundation of global empire. Every aspect of Mongol military culture was designed to produce victory through superior organization, communication, and coordination. Individual heroism was less important than collective effectiveness. Personal glory was less valuable than unit success. The army functioned like a single organism with thousands of parts working in perfect harmony. This systematic approach to warfare gave the Mongols decisive advantages over every enemy they encountered. Their opponents might be individually brave, well-equipped, or numerous, but none of them had developed military systems that could match Mongol coordination and tactical sophistication. The Great Hunt had taught them that success came through patience, planning, and perfect execution. These lessons, applied to human warfare, made them the masters of the known world. As the Mongol Empire expanded to encompass diverse civilizations, Genghis Khan faced a challenge that no previous nomadic leader had encountered. How could a people without written language govern literate societies? How could oral traditions be preserved while administering complex bureaucracies? The solution began with a decision that would transform Mongol culture forever. Genghis Khan ordered the adoption of the Uyghur script for writing the Mongol language. The Uyghurs were a Turkic people who had developed an efficient writing system based on earlier Sogdian models. This was not simply a matter of borrowing a foreign alphabet. It required adapting a script designed for one language to represent the sounds and concepts of a completely different language. Mongol scholars worked for years to create standardized spelling and grammar rules. The adoption of writing revolutionized Mongol society in ways that went far beyond simple record-keeping. For the first time, laws could be written down and preserved permanently. Administrative procedures could be standardized across vast distances. Cultural knowledge could be transmitted without relying entirely on human memory. The most important result was the creation of the Yasa, the great law code that governed the entire Mongol Empire. This comprehensive legal system covered everything from military discipline to commercial regulations to religious practices. It established consistent standards of justice that applied to all imperial subjects. The Yasa was remarkable for its emphasis on practical results rather than traditional precedents. Laws were designed to promote imperial unity and efficiency. Penalties were severe but clearly defined. Everyone knew exactly what behavior was expected and what consequences would follow violations. Religious tolerance was enshrined as a fundamental principle of imperial law. All faiths were protected as long as their followers remained loyal to the state. Churches, mosques, temples, and monasteries received imperial protection. Religious leaders were exempted from taxation and military service. This policy served both moral and practical purposes. Religious persecution created unnecessary conflicts that weakened imperial authority. Religious diversity brought different skills and perspectives that strengthened imperial administration. Religious leaders often commanded popular loyalty that could be channeled towards supporting the state. Genghis Khan personally participated in theological debates with representatives of different faiths. He questioned Christian missionaries about their beliefs. He discussed philosophy with Buddhist monks. He listened to Islamic scholars explain their interpretations of divine law. These conversations were not merely diplomatic gestures. The Khan was genuinely curious about the spiritual beliefs that motivated different peoples. He wanted to understand the sources of their strength and the reasons for their loyalty. He sought wisdom wherever it could be found. The integration of conquered peoples into imperial administration required unprecedented cultural adaptation. Chinese bureaucrats had to learn Mongol military terminology. Persian engineers had to coordinate with nomadic commanders. Arab merchants had to navigate legal systems that combined multiple traditions, but the adaptation flowed in both directions. Mongol administrators learned Chinese methods of record-keeping. Mongol generals adopted Persian techniques of siege warfare. Mongol merchants embraced Arab systems of credit and banking. This cultural exchange created hybrid institutions that were more effective than anything that had existed before. Imperial administration combined nomadic flexibility with sedentary expertise. Military organization merged steppe mobility with urban technology. Commercial networks connected pastoral economies with agricultural and manufacturing centers. The Mongol court became a truly cosmopolitan institution, where representatives of different civilizations worked together on common projects. Chinese scholars translated classical texts into Mongol. Persian artists created works celebrating Mongol victories. European craftsmen manufactured goods according to Mongol specifications. Language itself became a bridge between different cultures. Educated Mongols learned to speak Chinese, Persian, and Arabic. Foreign administrators learned enough Mongol to communicate with their superiors. Translators became essential figures in imperial governance. This linguistic diversity was seen as a strength rather than a problem. Different languages were used for different purposes depending on their particular advantages. Chinese was preferred for detailed administrative records. Persian was used for diplomatic correspondence. Arabic served for religious discussions. Mongol remained the primary language of military command. The educational system was expanded to train administrators who could function in this multilingual, multicultural environment. Schools were established in major cities throughout the empire. Curricula included both traditional Mongol values and practical skills needed for governing diverse populations. Women played important roles in this cultural transformation. Mongol women had traditionally enjoyed significant freedom and influence. As the empire expanded, they served as cultural ambassadors who helped integrate conquered peoples. They often learned foreign languages and customs more quickly than men. Sorkaktani, one of Genghis Khan's daughters-in-law, became particularly influential in promoting religious tolerance and cultural understanding. She was an Nestorian Christian who maintained excellent relationships with Buddhist, Islamic, and traditional Mongol religious leaders. Her sons would later rule different parts of the empire and continue her policies of inclusion. The preservation of local customs and traditions was actively encouraged, where they did not conflict with imperial authority. Festivals and ceremonies continued as before. Art forms and literary traditions received imperial patronage. Regional differences were celebrated rather than suppressed. This approach created loyalty that went beyond mere submission to superior force. Conquered peoples found that Mongol rule often preserved their cultural heritage better than their previous rulers had done. They began to see themselves as partners in a great enterprise rather than victims of foreign domination. The nomad became cosmopolitan, ruling Christians and Muslims, Buddhists and Confucians. Genghis Khan had created something unprecedented in human history, a truly multicultural empire that drew strength from its diversity rather than being weakened by it. The Cultural Revolution initiated by the adoption of writing had transformed the Mongol Empire into a new form of civilization. It combined the mobility and flexibility of nomadic traditions with the sophistication and knowledge of settled societies. It created institutions that could govern effectively across vast distances and cultural differences. This transformation would have profound consequences for the future development of the empire. It established precedents for religious tolerance and cultural diversity that would influence societies for centuries to come. It created administrative methods that later empires would copy and adapt. Most importantly, it demonstrated that nomadic and settled civilizations were not incompatible opposites, but complementary aspects of human society that could be combined to create something greater than either could achieve alone. By 1226, Genghis Khan had reached his 60th year. This was an advanced age for any medieval ruler, but especially for one who had spent his entire adult life in military campaigns. His body bore the accumulated wounds of countless battles. His hair had turned white, His hands, once steady enough to draw a bow with perfect accuracy, sometimes trembled with age, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. His strategic vision continued to encompass the entire known world. His ambitions had not diminished despite his physical decline. If anything, he seemed driven by an awareness that time was running short for completing his grand design. The Western Xia had been defeated years earlier, but they had proven unreliable vassals. They had failed to provide promised troops for the Khwarezmid campaign. They had shown signs of planning rebellion against Mongol authority. Genghis Khan decided that they needed to be taught a final permanent lesson. The campaign against Western Xia in 1227 was different from his earlier wars. This was not a conquest for expansion or exploration. It was a punitive expedition designed to eliminate a source of future problems. The Khan intended to destroy the Xia kingdom so completely that it could never threaten Mongol interest again. The military operations proceeded with the systematic efficiency that had become characteristic of Mongol warfare. Cities were besieged and captured according to well-established procedures. Resistance was crushed with overwhelming force. The Xia army was scattered and destroyed in a series of encounters that demonstrated Mongol tactical superiority. But something was different about the Khan himself during this campaign. Those who served closest to him noticed changes in his behavior and appearance. He seemed more tired than usual after long marches. He spent more time in meditation and less time in strategy sessions. He spoke often about death and the afterlife. The exact circumstances of Genghis Khan's death remain one of history's great mysteries. Some sources claim he died from injuries received in a fall from his horse during a hunting expedition. Others suggest that he succumbed to illness that had been weakening him for months. Still others whisper about assassination or poisoning by enemies within his own camp. What is certain is that the great conqueror died in August 1227 while the campaign against Western Xia was still in progress. His death was kept secret from all but his closest advisors. The army continued its operations as if nothing had changed. The final destruction of the Xia kingdom proceeded exactly as planned. This secrecy served important strategic purposes. Enemy armies might have been encouraged to resist more fiercely if they knew the Great Khan was dead. Allied forces might have become demoralized or begun to fragment. The carefully planned succession arrangements might have been disrupted by premature political maneuvering. When the Xia capital finally fell and the campaign objectives were achieved, Genghis Khan's body was transported back toward Mongolia with elaborate precautions to maintain secrecy. According to legend, anyone who encountered the funeral procession was killed immediately to prevent news of the Khan's death from spreading prematurely. The burial itself became part of Mongol mythology. The location was kept absolutely secret. The grave contained no markers or monuments that might attract attention. Some accounts claim that a river was temporarily diverted to flow over the burial site, making it impossible to locate later. The funeral was accompanied by massive human sacrifice. Hundreds of servants, guards, and horses were killed so they could serve the Khan in the afterlife. This practice reflected traditional Mongol beliefs about death and the continuation of relationships beyond the grave. But the most important aspect of Genghis Khan's death was not the funeral rituals but the succession arrangements he had made. He had spent years preparing his empire for the transition to new leadership. He had identified capable successors and defined their roles. He had established institutions that could function independently of any single individual. His third son, Ögedei, had been chosen as the next great Khan through a combination of ability and political acceptability. Ögedei was known for his administrative skills and his ability to work with different factions within the Mongol leadership. He was less militarily gifted than some of his brothers, but more suited for the complex task of governing a vast empire. The other sons received important territorial assignments that reflected both their abilities and the strategic needs of the empire. Jochi, the eldest, had been given responsibility for the Western territories, though he died shortly before his father. Chagatai received Central Asian lands that required careful management of diverse populations. Tolui, the youngest, inherited the traditional Mongol heartland and the responsibility for maintaining traditional values. This division of authority was designed to prevent succession conflicts that could tear the empire apart. Each brother had clear responsibilities and sufficient resources to fulfill them. Competition between them was channeled into productive achievements rather than destructive warfare. The arrangements also reflected Genghis Khan's understanding that the empire had grown too large for any single ruler to govern effectively. Different regions required different approaches and specialized knowledge. Decentralization was necessary for continued success, but it had to be managed carefully to prevent fragmentation. The transition period immediately following the Khan's death tested the strength of these arrangements. Various factions within the empire watched carefully to see if the succession would proceed smoothly or dissolve into civil war. Foreign enemies hoped that Mongol unity would collapse with the death of its creator. Instead, the imperial government continued to function with remarkable stability. Orders continued to flow from the capital to distant provinces. Military campaigns proceeded according to established plans. Administrative systems maintained their efficiency. The empire demonstrated that it had become an institution rather than just the personal domain of a single charismatic leader. News of Genghis Khan's death eventually spread throughout the known world. Reactions varied dramatically depending on each society's experience with Mongol rule. Some celebrated the end of their greatest enemy. Others mourned the loss of a ruler who had brought them peace and prosperity. All recognized that an era had ended and a new chapter in world history was beginning. So ended the life of the man who had united the world under a single banner. He had been born as Temujin, the son of a minor tribal chief who died when the boy was only 9 years old. He had survived exile, imprisonment, and betrayal to become the most powerful ruler in human history. His empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. His armies had defeated every enemy they encountered. His laws governed more people than any previous ruler had even imagined. His influence would shape the development of human civilization for centuries to come, but perhaps his greatest achievement was not conquest but transformation. He had created new forms of government that combined efficiency with tolerance. He had established trade networks that connected distant civilizations. He had promoted religious freedom and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The world after Genghis Khan's death was fundamentally different from the world that had existed before his birth. Barriers between East and West had been broken down. Ideas and technologies flowed freely across vast distances. Different peoples had learned to cooperate despite their differences. The man who had once clutched blood in his infant fist had indeed gained power over his enemies. But his true legacy lay not in destruction, but in creation. He had built something that would outlast his own life and influence the course of human history for generations to come. The Mongol Empire would continue to expand under his successors. It would reach its greatest extent and achieve its most remarkable accomplishments in the decades following his death. But all of these later achievements would be built upon the foundation that Genghis Khan had established through his vision, determination, and revolutionary understanding of how diverse peoples could be united in common purpose. The Great Kurultai that would determine the future of the Mongol Empire convened in 1229, nearly 2 years after Genghis Khan's death. Representatives from across the vast territories gathered on the steppes of Mongolia. Chiefs and generals, administrators and shamans all came to witness the selection of the new Great Khan. The delay had been deliberate. Genghis Khan's youngest son, Tolui, had served as regent during the intervening period. This gave different factions time to build support for their preferred candidates. It allowed emotions to cool after the shock of the great conqueror's death. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the empire could function effectively even without a supreme ruler. The choice of Ögedei as the new Great Khan was not surprising to those who understood Mongol politics. His father had clearly indicated this preference before his death. Ögedei had proven himself as both a military commander and an administrator. Perhaps most importantly, he was acceptable to the different branches of the royal family. Unlike some of his brothers, Ögedei was known for his diplomatic skills and his ability to build consensus among competing interests. He was not the most brilliant military strategist or the most charismatic leader. but he possessed the steady judgment needed to hold together an empire that was becoming increasingly complex and diverse. His first major decision was to complete the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. This campaign had been suspended during the succession period, allowing the Chinese to rebuild their defences and gather new armies. Ögedei understood that leaving this task unfinished would be seen as a sign of Mongol weakness. The final assault on the Jin dynasty demonstrated how much Mongol warfare had evolved since the early days of Genghis Khan. This was not a campaign of sudden raids and lightning strikes. It was a systematic operation designed to eliminate all remaining resistance permanently. Mongol armies surrounded every major Jin fortress simultaneously. Siege engineers had perfected their techniques during years of previous campaigns. Chinese defenders found themselves facing weapons and tactics that surpassed their own technological capabilities. The fall of Kaifeng, the Jin capital, in 1233 marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled northern China for over a century. The last Jin emperor died in the siege, bringing to a close a conflict that had begun under Genghis Khan 2 decades earlier. But Ögedei's vision extended far beyond completing his father's unfinished business. He had been studying reports from Subutai and Yebe about their European reconnaissance. He understood that the western lands offered opportunities that were too valuable to ignore. The decision to invade Europe represented a new level of strategic thinking within the Mongol Empire. Previous campaigns had usually been responses to immediate threats or opportunities. The European invasion was planned years in advance with careful attention to logistics, intelligence, and long-term objectives. Subutai, now recognized as the greatest military strategist of his generation, was given overall command of the European expedition. Under his direction, multiple armies would strike across a front that extended from Poland to Hungary. This coordinated assault would prevent European kingdoms from uniting against the invasion. The campaign began in 1241 with attacks that demonstrated the enormous gap between Mongol and European military capabilities. Polish armies were destroyed at the Battle of Mohi before they could coordinate with their allies. Hungarian forces met similar fates when they tried to resist using traditional European tactics. The speed and efficiency of these victories shocked European observers. Entire kingdoms were conquered in weeks rather than months. Fortifications that had protected cities for centuries were overcome with apparent ease. Armies that had seemed formidable were scattered like leaves in a storm. The Mongol invasion created panic throughout Western Europe. Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade against these mysterious eastern invaders. French and English kings began preparing defences against enemies who might appear at any moment. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II offered to lead a coalition against the Mongol threat, but these preparations proved unnecessary. At the height of their success, when Mongol armies were positioned to advance into the heart of Europe, news arrived that changed everything. Ögedei Khan had died suddenly at his capital in Karakorum. The death occurred in December 1241, at a time when the Khan seemed to be in good health. Some sources suggest excessive drinking may have contributed to his demise. Others hint at possible poisoning by rivals within the royal family. The true cause remains a mystery that has never been satisfactorily resolved. What is certain is that Ögedei's death immediately transformed the situation in Europe. According to Mongol law and tradition, major military campaigns had to be suspended when the great Khan died. All princes and generals were required to return to Mongolia to participate in selecting a new ruler. Subutai received the news while his armies were preparing to advance toward Vienna and beyond. Despite being on the verge of conquests that would have reshaped European history, he ordered an immediate withdrawal. Within weeks, Mongol forces had disappeared from European territory as suddenly as they had appeared. The withdrawal was conducted with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the invasion. Mongol armies retreated in good order, taking their captives and plunder with them. They left behind a European continent that had been fundamentally changed by this brief but devastating encounter. European chroniclers struggled to understand what had happened to them. Some credited divine intervention for their salvation. Others believed that European resistance had been more effective than it actually was. Few recognized the true reason for their deliverance. Europe was saved not by its arms, but by the death of a Khan 5,000 miles away. The Mongol withdrawal demonstrated both the remarkable discipline of their military forces and the continuing importance of traditional succession procedures within their political system. The European invasion had revealed the military superiority that the Mongol Empire could project across vast distances. It had also shown the limitations imposed by their governmental structure. Personal loyalty to the Great Khan remained more important than territorial conquest or strategic advantage. Ogedai's reign had lasted 13 years and accomplished remarkable achievements. He had completed the conquest of northern China. He had demonstrated Mongol power in Europe. He had continued the administrative reforms begun by his father. He had maintained unity within an empire that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern from a single centre. His death marked the end of the first phase of Mongol expansion. The era of rapid territorial conquest was giving way to more complex challenges of governing diverse populations across enormous distances. The next generation of leaders would face problems that required different skills and different solutions. The systematic conquest that Ogedai had perfected would be continued by his successors, but never again with quite the same single-minded focus. The empire was becoming too large and too diverse for the simple solutions that had worked during the early decades of expansion. The death of Ogedai Khan created a power vacuum that took 4 years to resolve. According to Mongol tradition, the next great Khan had to be chosen by a kurultai of all the royal princes and tribal leaders. But organizing such a gathering took time, and different factions used that time to maneuver for advantage. During this interregnum, effective power rested with Ogedai's widow, Torogen Khatun. She served as regent with the support of the imperial bureaucracy. This was not unusual in Mongol society, where women could hold significant political authority, but it created tensions with princes who believed they should be ruling in their own right. Torogen was a skillful politician who understood the complex relationships within the royal family. She knew that rushing to elect a new Khan could lead to civil war if the losing factions felt their interests had been ignored. She preferred to build consensus gradually, rather than force a decision that might later be challenged. Her preferred candidate was her eldest son Guyuk. He had proven himself as a military commander during the European campaigns. He had the support of important generals and administrators. Most significantly, he was Ogedai's designated heir according to the succession arrangements made before the previous Khan's death. But Guyuk also had powerful enemies within the royal family. Some princes believed he was too young and inexperienced for supreme leadership. Others resented his mother's influence and wanted to choose someone who would be more independent. Still others had their own ambitions for the throne. The most serious opposition came from Batu Khan, who ruled the western territories conquered during the European invasion. Batu was a grandson of Genghis Khan and commanded enormous military resources. He had quarrelled with Guyuk during the European campaigns and refused to support his candidacy. This family conflict reflected deeper tensions about the future direction of the empire. Should the Mongols continue their aggressive expansion, or should they consolidate their existing territories? Should power remain centralized in Mongolia, or should regional leaders have more autonomy? Should traditional nomadic values be preserved, or should the empire adapt to the needs of its settled populations? During the Regency period, these questions became more pressing as contacts with the outside world increased. European kingdoms were sending diplomatic missions to the Mongol court. The Pope had authorized envoys to negotiate with the mysterious Eastern Empire. These contacts required responses that would establish precedents for future international relations. The arrival of John of Monte Corvino and other European missionaries marked the first serious diplomatic contact between the Mongol Empire and Western Europe. These men were not just religious figures, but also political representatives carrying messages from European rulers. The European envoys were amazed by what they found at the Mongol court. They had expected to encounter primitive barbarians living in crude conditions. Instead, they discovered a sophisticated imperial administration that governed territories larger than all of Europe combined. The Mongol capital at Karakoram was a cosmopolitan city where representatives of different civilizations worked together. Chinese scholars served alongside Persian administrators. Arab merchants traded with European craftsmen. Buddhist monks debated with Christian priests and Islamic theologians. This diversity impressed the European visitors, but it also created challenges for Mongol leadership. How could traditional nomadic values be preserved while governing such varied populations? How could imperial unity be maintained across such enormous distances and cultural differences? When the Kurultai finally convened in 1246, these questions influenced the debates about succession. Guyuk's supporters argued that strong central leadership was essential for maintaining imperial unity. His opponents claimed that decentralization would be more effective for governing diverse territories. The election of Guyuk as Great Khan was ultimately successful, but it revealed the growing divisions within the Mongol leadership. The victory was narrow, and many important princes remained dissatisfied with the result. The new Khan would rule over an empire that was increasingly difficult to hold together through traditional methods. Guyuk's reign was brief and troubled. He spent most of his time dealing with internal political conflicts rather than external expansion. The quarrel with Batu Khan continued to fester, creating the possibility of civil war within the royal family. More seriously, Guyuk showed signs of wanting to reverse some of the policies that had made the empire successful. He was less tolerant of religious diversity than his predecessors had been. He showed favoritism towards certain ethnic groups within the imperial administration. He seemed more interested in personal power than in the collective welfare of the empire. These tendencies alarmed many of the experienced administrators and generals who had served under Genghis Khan and Ogedei. They had seen how tolerance and meritocracy had strengthened the empire. They worried that Guyuk's policies would create unnecessary conflicts that would weaken Mongol power. The crisis was resolved by Guyuk's sudden death in 1248, just 2 years after his election. Like his father's death, the circumstances were mysterious. Some sources suggest natural causes, possibly related to excessive drinking. Others hint at poisoning by political rivals. The death prevented what might have become a destructive civil war between different branches of the royal family. But it also demonstrated the continuing instability within the Mongol leadership. The empire needed stronger institutions that could survive the deaths of individual rulers. The brief reigns of Ogedei and Guyuk had revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Mongol political system. The empire could function effectively under competent leadership, but it was vulnerable to disruption when succession disputes arose. Growing tensions between different branches of the family reflected deeper disagreements about imperial policy. These conflicts would need to be resolved if the empire was to continue its expansion and maintain its unity. The stage was set for another succession crisis that would test the fundamental stability of the Mongol Empire. The next election would determine whether the empire could overcome its internal divisions and resume its growth, or whether it would fragment into competing kingdoms ruled by rival members of the royal family. The Kurultai that elected Mongol Khan in 1251 marked a turning point in the history of the Mongol Empire. For the first time, a great Khan came to power through what amounted to a palace coup, rather than genuine consensus among all branches of the royal family. Mongol was the son of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son who had served as regent after the great conqueror's death. He had the support of his brother Kublai and the backing of important military commanders who were frustrated with the political instability of recent years. But his election was opposed by the descendants of Ogedei and Chagatai, who felt that their branches of the family were being pushed aside. Several princes were executed for plotting against the new Khan. Others fled to distant territories where they continued to resist his authority. This violent beginning set the tone for Mongol's reign. He was determined to restore the aggressive expansionist policies of earlier decades. He believed that military conquest was essential for maintaining Mongol unity and power. Internal divisions could only be overcome through external success. His strategic vision was remarkably ambitious even by Mongol standards. He planned simultaneous campaigns that would complete the conquest of China, destroy the remaining Islamic powers in the Middle East, and resumed the invasion of Europe that had been interrupted by Ogeday's death. The campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China was assigned to his brother Kublai. This would be the most difficult conquest the Mongols had ever attempted. The Song territories were protected by major rivers, dense forests, and sophisticated fortifications. The population was larger than all previous Mongol conquest combined. Moreover, the Song dynasty had used the decades of Mongol expansion to strengthen their defences and develop new military technologies. They had studied Mongol tactics and created countermeasures. They had built alliances with other powers threatened by Mongol expansion. The conquest would require innovations in Mongol warfare that went beyond anything attempted before. Traditional cavalry tactics were ineffective in the rice paddies and river systems of southern China. Siege techniques had to be adapted for cities that were larger and more sophisticated than any previously encountered. Kublai proved equal to these challenges. He recruited Chinese engineers and naval specialists who understood the special conditions of southern warfare. He developed new tactics that combined traditional Mongol mobility with Chinese expertise in riverine operations. The campaign lasted for decades and required resources on an unprecedented scale. Entire forests were cut down to build siege engines and naval vessels. Canals were dug to redirect rivers and flood enemy positions. Cities were besieged for years rather than months. When the Song capital of Hangzhou finally fell in 1276, it marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled southern China for 3 centuries. More importantly, it completed the Mongol conquest of the most populous and wealthy region in the world. While Kublai was conquering China, Mengke assigned the Middle Eastern campaign to his brother Hulagu. This expedition had goals that went beyond territorial expansion. It was intended to eliminate the Islamic powers that posed potential threats to Mongol rule in Central Asia. The primary target was Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the symbolic centre of the Islamic world. The city had been the heart of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries. Its libraries contained the accumulated knowledge of Islamic scholarship. Its palaces housed treasures collected from across the Muslim world. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 was conducted with systematic brutality that shocked even hardened Mongol veterans. When the city finally fell, Hulagu ordered its complete destruction. The caliph and his family were executed. The entire population was either killed or enslaved. The destruction extended beyond human casualties to the very foundations of Islamic civilization. The great libraries were burned, destroying manuscripts that represented centuries of scholarly work. Irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for millennia were deliberately destroyed. The city itself was left largely uninhabited. The libraries of Baghdad burned for weeks, and the Tigris ran black with ink from the destroyed manuscripts. This phrase, recorded by contemporary chroniclers, captured the magnitude of cultural destruction that accompanied the military conquest. The fall of Baghdad had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military victory. It marked the effective end of the Islamic Golden Age that had produced remarkable achievements in science, mathematics, philosophy, and literature. Centres of learning that had flourished for centuries were eliminated in a matter of weeks, but the destruction also served strategic purposes within Mongol imperial policy. It eliminated a rival centre of authority that might have challenged Mongol supremacy. It demonstrated the consequences of resistance to other Islamic rulers. It removed a potential rallying point for future rebellions. The Middle Eastern campaigns also revealed the growing complexity of governing the Mongol Empire. Different regions required different approaches that reflected local conditions and traditions. What worked in China might not work in the Islamic world. What succeeded on the steppes might fail in urban environments. Mengke's reign represented the last great burst of Mongol expansion. His systematic approach to conquest completed the absorption of the world's most advanced civilizations, but it also pushed the empire to its absolute limits in terms of administration, communication, and control. The death of Mengke in 1259 during the siege of a Chinese fortress marked the end of an era. Like his predecessors, he died at the height of his power while engaged in military campaigns. His death created another succession crisis that would have permanent consequences for imperial unity. But unlike previous succession disputes, this one could not be resolved through traditional methods. The empire had become too large and too diverse for a single ruler to govern effectively from Mongolia. Regional leaders had developed their own power bases and their own interests. The final push had achieved remarkable military successes, but it had also revealed the fundamental limitations of the traditional Mongol political system. Centralized authority could not be maintained across such vast distances and cultural differences. New forms of organization would be necessary for the empire to survive and prosper. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 precipitated the final transformation of the Mongol Empire. What had begun as a unified state ruled from Mongolia would now become 4 separate khanates, each governing different regions according to their particular needs and circumstances. This division was not planned or desired by anyone in the Mongol leadership. It emerged from practical necessities that could no longer be ignored. The empire had simply grown too vast for effective central control, and regional leaders had developed their own priorities and interests. The succession dispute between Munka's brothers, Kublai and Arik Berke, provided the immediate catalyst for fragmentation. Kublai controlled China and had the support of Chinese administrators and military forces. Arik Berke held Mongolia and commanded the loyalty of traditional nomadic leaders. Both brothers claimed to be the rightful Great Khan, and both were elected by rival Kurultais. This constitutional crisis made unified imperial government impossible. Regional leaders were forced to choose sides or declare their independence from both claimants. The Yuan dynasty in China became Kublai Khan's power base after his victory in the Succession War. This was no longer a traditional Mongol Khanate, but a Chinese imperial dynasty that happened to be ruled by Mongols. Kublai adopted Chinese governmental structures, established his capital at Beijing, and ruled according to Chinese precedents. The transformation was remarkably complete. The Yuan court used Chinese ceremonies and protocols. Chinese became the primary language of administration. Confucian scholars were recruited to serve in governmental positions. Traditional Mongol customs were preserved mainly for ceremonial purposes. This adaptation reflected the practical realities of governing the most populous and sophisticated society in the world. Chinese governmental traditions had evolved over millennia to manage complex agricultural and commercial systems. Mongol administrative methods, however effective on the steppes, were inadequate for ruling hundreds of millions of settled farmers and urban dwellers. The Ilkhanate in the Middle East underwent a similar transformation under Hulagu Khan and his successors. Persian became the dominant language of administration. Islamic governmental practices were adopted where they proved effective. The capital was established at Tabriz, far from the original Mongol homeland. The Ilkhanate rulers eventually converted to Islam, completing their integration into Middle Eastern civilization. This conversion was not just a personal religious choice, but a political necessity. It allowed them to gain legitimacy among their primarily Muslim subjects and to participate effectively in regional diplomatic relationships. The Golden Horde in Eastern Europe and Western Asia represented a different approach to the challenge of governing settled populations. The Khans of the Golden Horde maintained their nomadic lifestyle, while establishing tributary relationships with Russian principalities and other settled states. This system allowed them to extract wealth from agricultural societies without taking direct responsibility for detailed administration. Local rulers continued to govern their own peoples according to traditional methods, but they paid tribute to the Mongol Khans and provided military service when required. The Golden Horde also eventually converted to Islam, though this process took longer than in the Ilkhanate. The conversion reflected both the influence of Muslim merchants and administrators and the political advantages of alignment with other Islamic powers in the region. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia faced the most complex challenges because it included both nomadic and settled populations. The region was a crossroads where different civilizations met and interacted. Buddhist, Islamic, and traditional beliefs coexisted uneasily within the same territories. This diversity made unified governmental policies difficult to implement. Different groups had conflicting needs and interests. What benefited nomadic herders might harm settled farmers. What pleased Muslim merchants might offend Buddhist monasteries. The Chagatai Khans dealt with this complexity through a policy of deliberate decentralization. Local communities were allowed to govern themselves according to their traditional methods as long as they paid taxes and provided military service. The Khan's government focused on maintaining security and facilitating trade rather than imposing uniform cultural or religious practices. Cultural adaptation varied significantly among the four Khanates, reflecting the different environments in which they operated. The Yuan dynasty became thoroughly Chinese in most respects. The Ilkhanate adopted Persian and Islamic traditions. The Golden Horde maintained nomadic customs while ruling settled subjects. The Chagatai Khanate preserved Mongol traditions most completely, but all four Khanates faced the same fundamental challenge: how to maintain their Mongol identity while governing populations that were culturally different from their rulers. The solutions they developed reflected both the flexibility of Mongol institutions and the diversity of the civilizations they had conquered. The transformation from conquerors to rulers required new skills and new attitudes. Military prowess remained important, but diplomatic ability became equally valuable. Knowledge of local customs and languages became essential for effective governance. Understanding of agricultural and commercial systems became necessary for maintaining prosperity. The division into four Khanates also reflected changes in the international environment. The period of rapid expansion was ending because most of the available targets had already been conquered. Future growth would require more sophisticated methods than traditional military conquest. Trade became increasingly important as a source of imperial revenue. The different Khanates controlled different segments of the trade routes connecting east and west. Cooperation between them was essential for maintaining the flow of goods and the profits derived from taxation. Diplomatic relationships with non-Mongol powers also became more complex. The Khanates had to deal with surviving independent states as equals rather than as potential conquest targets. This required new approaches to international relations that emphasized negotiation rather than intimidation. The empire became too vast for a single mind to govern, and so it became four. This division marked the end of the unified Mongol Empire, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in which Mongol rulers became integral parts of the civilizations they governed. Each Khanate would develop its own characteristics and face its own challenges in the centuries that followed. But all would carry forward elements of the Mongol legacy: religious tolerance, cultural diversity, merit-based advancement, and the integration of different peoples within common political frameworks. The Great Expansion had reached its limits, not through military defeat, but through the practical impossibilities of governing such diverse territories from a single centre. The Mongol Empire had succeeded so completely that it had outgrown the political structures that created it. The division of the Mongol Empire into four Khanates might have seemed like the end of unified rule, but in many ways it marked the beginning of the most remarkable period of cultural and economic exchange in human history. The different Khanates needed to cooperate with each other to maintain trade and communication across their vast territories. This cooperation created something unprecedented: a secure corridor for trade and travel that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic. For the first time in history, merchants could journey from China to Europe with reasonable confidence that they would not be robbed, imprisoned, or killed by local rulers along the way. The Mongols called this system the Pax Mongolica, meaning Mongol peace. It was similar to the later Pax Romana that would be established by the Roman Empire, but it covered much larger territories and included far more diverse populations. Under Mongol protection, trade flourished on a scale never seen before. The key to this success was the Mongol policy of protecting merchants and encouraging commerce. Trade taxes provided steady revenue that was often more valuable than plunder from military campaigns. Prosperous merchants could afford to pay higher taxes than impoverished farmers. Busy trade routes generated wealth that benefited everyone along their path. The Yam postal system, originally created for military communications, became the backbone of international commerce. Relay stations provided fresh horses and safe lodging for travelling merchants. Official documents guaranteed safe passage through different territories. Local governors were held personally responsible for protecting traders in their regions. These protections transformed the ancient Silk Road from a dangerous adventure into a reliable business opportunity. Caravans that had once required military escorts could now travel with minimal guards. Journey times were reduced because merchants no longer needed to avoid dangerous areas or wait for armed protection. The security also encouraged new types of trade that had been impossible before. Luxury goods from China found eager buyers in European markets. Islamic manuscripts reached scholars in Mongolia and China. European craftsmen gained access to techniques and materials from across Asia, but the exchange went far beyond simple commerce in physical goods. Ideas travelled the trade routes as readily as silk and spices. Religious concepts, scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and artistic styles spread across continents with unprecedented speed. Chinese printing technology reached the Islamic world, where it was adapted for Arabic script. Islamic mathematical concepts, including the use of zero, reached European scholars through Mongol intermediaries. European mechanical innovations found their way to Chinese workshops where they were refined and improved. The movement of people was equally important. Craftsmen, scholars, artists, and administrators relocated to places where their skills were valued. A Chinese engineer might find employment in a Persian city. An Arab mathematician might teach in a Mongol court. A European merchant might settle permanently in a Chinese trading centre. This human mobility created communities of foreigners in major cities throughout the Mongol territories. These communities served as cultural bridges that facilitated understanding between different civilizations. They translated languages, explained customs, and mediated disputes between people from different backgrounds. The Mongol capitals became truly international cities where representatives of different civilizations lived and worked together. Karakorum in Mongolia, Khanbalik in China, Tabriz in Persia, and Sarai in the Golden Horde all attracted visitors from across the known world. Technological innovations spread with remarkable speed along the Mongol trade routes. Gunpowder, invented in China for fireworks and mining, reached the Middle East where it was developed into weapons. These weapons then travelled to Europe where they revolutionized warfare and castle design. Navigation techniques developed by Chinese sailors found their way to Arab navigators in the Indian Ocean. These innovations then reached European explorers who would use them to discover new continents. The compass, originally a Chinese invention for fortune-telling, became an essential tool for global navigation. Paper money, first used in China during the Song dynasty, was adopted by Mongol administrations and spread westward. This innovation made large-scale commerce much more practical by eliminating the need to transport heavy coins across vast distances. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies across Mongol territories made trade calculations much simpler. Merchants no longer needed to convert between dozens of different systems as they traveled from city to city. Standard measurements meant that contracts signed in one place would be honored everywhere else. Cultural synthesis occurred as different artistic traditions encountered each other. Chinese silk patterns incorporated Persian motifs. Islamic architectural styles influenced Mongol palace design. European mechanical techniques were adapted for Chinese clockmaking. This cultural blending created new art forms that combined elements from multiple traditions. Mongol patrons commissioned works that reflected their cosmopolitan tastes. Artists learned techniques from foreign masters and created hybrid styles that had never existed before. The exchange also included less welcome phenomena. Disease spread along trade routes just as readily as goods and ideas. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century probably originated in Central Asia and travelled westward along Mongol trade routes. This plague killed millions of people, but also demonstrated how closely connected the Eurasian world had become. For a brief moment in history, the known world was one marketplace. Goods produced in one corner of Eurasia could be sold in markets thousands of miles away. Ideas developed in one civilization could influence thinkers in completely different cultures. People could travel across continents with reasonable safety and predictable procedures. The Silk Road Renaissance represented the first truly global economy in human history. It demonstrated what was possible when political barriers were removed and when different peoples were encouraged to cooperate rather than compete. It created precedents for international trade and cultural exchange that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. This remarkable period of openness and exchange would not last forever. The Mongol Empire would eventually fragment further, and political instability would disrupt the trade routes. But for several generations, the world experienced a level of international cooperation and cultural synthesis that would not be seen again until the modern era. Among the many merchants who travelled the Mongol trade routes, none would become more famous than a young man from Venice named Marco Polo. His journey to China and his years of service in the court of Kublai Khan would provide Europeans with their first detailed account of the sophisticated civilizations of the East. Marco Polo was not the first European to reach China during the Mongol period. His father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo had made an earlier journey and had been well received by Kublai Khan. The Khan had even sent them back to Europe with a request that the Pope send learned men to teach him about Christianity and Western knowledge. When the Polo family returned to China in 1275, they brought 17-year-old Marco with them. The young man was bright, curious, and eager to learn about the wonders he encountered along the way. He kept detailed records of everything he saw and experienced during the journey. The route they followed took them through the heart of the Mongol Empire. They travelled from Venice through Constantinople to the Black Sea. From there they crossed the Caucasus Mountains and entered Central Asia. They followed the ancient Silk Road through Samarkand and other famous trading cities before finally reaching China. The journey took over 3 years and covered more than 5,000 miles. It demonstrated the remarkable infrastructure that the Mongols had created for long-distance travel. The Polo family was able to obtain fresh horses, food, and lodging at regular intervals throughout their trip. More importantly, they travelled in safety under the protection of Mongol authorities. The documents they carried guaranteed them safe passage through different territories. Local officials were required to assist them and ensure their comfort. This level of security would have been impossible just a century earlier. When Marco Polo finally arrived at Kublai Khan's court in Khanbalik, he entered a world that surpassed anything he had imagined. The city that is now Beijing was larger and more magnificent than any European settlement. Its palaces, gardens, and temples displayed wealth and artistry that amazed the young Italian. The Khan's court was equally impressive in its international character. Administrators from China worked alongside advisors from Persia, Central Asia, and other conquered territories. The court spoke multiple languages and followed customs that blended different cultural traditions. Kublai Khan himself was fascinated by his European visitors. He questioned them extensively about their homeland, their customs, and their knowledge. He was particularly interested in European technology, military techniques, and governmental practices. The Khan was so impressed by young Marco Polo that he appointed him to various positions within the imperial administration. For the next 17 years, Marco served as diplomatic envoy, administrative official, and observer of Chinese society. He travelled throughout the empire on official business, gaining experiences that no other European of his time would enjoy. These travels took him to regions that Europeans had never seen. He visited the great trading cities of southern China. He observed the sophisticated agricultural systems that fed millions of people. He studied the canal networks that connected different regions. He witnessed manufacturing techniques that were centuries ahead of European methods. Marco Polo was particularly amazed by Chinese use of paper money instead of metal coins. He described this innovation in detail, though most Europeans found it difficult to believe that people would accept pieces of paper as payment for valuable goods. The concept of credit and banking was far more advanced in China than in medieval Europe. He also marvelled at the Chinese postal system, which was even more sophisticated than the Mongol yam. Messages could be delivered quickly across vast distances. The system included provisions for emergency communications that could travel faster than any European equivalent. The young Italian was fascinated by Chinese technological achievements. He observed the use of coal for fuel, a practice unknown in Europe at that time. He saw mechanical clocks that were more accurate than anything available in the West. He witnessed the use of gunpowder for both military and mining purposes. Chinese printing technology particularly impressed him. Books could be produced quickly and cheaply compared to the laborious hand-copying methods used in European monasteries. This made knowledge more widely available and allowed for rapid dissemination of new ideas. The cultural sophistication of Chinese society also amazed Marco Polo. He attended theatrical performances that used elaborate staging and special effects. He observed astronomical observations that were more precise than European equivalents. He studied educational systems that produced highly literate populations, but perhaps most impressive was the administrative efficiency of the Mongol government in China. The empire was governed through systems that coordinated activities across enormous distances. Tax collection, military organization, and public works projects were managed with a precision that surpassed anything in medieval Europe. The mutual fascination between East and West was evident in Kublai Khan's court. Chinese officials were curious about European customs and knowledge. They asked detailed questions about European cities, governments, and technologies. They were particularly interested in European mathematical and mechanical achievements. This cultural exchange benefited both sides. Europeans learned about advanced Chinese technologies and governmental methods. Chinese scholars gained new perspectives from European visitors. The court became a centre for international intellectual collaboration. When Marco Polo finally returned to Europe in 1295, he carried with him detailed knowledge of civilizations that most Europeans could barely imagine. His later book, The Description of the World, would provide Europeans with their first comprehensive account of Asian societies. The book described cities with millions of inhabitants, trade networks that spanned continents, and technological achievements that seemed almost magical to European readers. Many people found his account so remarkable that they nicknamed him Marco Milione, suggesting that he exaggerated numbers and descriptions. But modern scholars have confirmed that most of Marco Polo's descriptions were accurate. His accounts provide valuable historical evidence about the sophistication of Mongol administration and the advanced state of Chinese civilization during the Yuan dynasty period. East met West in the courts of the Great Khan. The encounter between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan symbolized a broader process of cultural exchange that was transforming both European and Asian civilizations. Ideas, technologies, and perspectives were being shared across vast distances in ways that had never been possible before. The Polo family's experiences demonstrated the opportunities that Mongol rule had created for international travel and cultural understanding. Their success encouraged other Europeans to make similar journeys and to establish permanent trading relationships with Asian societies. Marco Polo's detailed records also provided future generations with a window into a remarkable period of human history. His accounts show us a world where different civilizations were learning from each other and where international cooperation was creating unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mongol Empire was how its rulers, who had conquered the world through military might, gradually adopted the religions of the peoples they governed. This transformation occurred differently in each region, but followed similar patterns of practical accommodation and genuine spiritual conversion. The original Mongol religion was shamanism, a belief system that emphasized harmony with natural forces and communication with spiritual beings. Shamans served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. They conducted ceremonies to ensure good weather, successful hunts, and victory in battle. This traditional belief system worked well for nomadic peoples living on the steppes, but as Mongol rulers found themselves governing millions of settled peoples with sophisticated religious traditions, they faced new spiritual and political challenges. In China, Buddhism had been the dominant religion for centuries before the Mongol conquest. Buddhist monasteries controlled vast land holdings. Buddhist scholars had developed sophisticated philosophical systems. Buddhist art and architecture reflected centuries of refined cultural development. Kublai Khan and his successors in the Yuan dynasty gradually embraced Buddhism while maintaining respect for traditional Mongol shamanism. This dual approach allowed them to appeal to both their nomadic followers and their Chinese subjects. The Khan invited Buddhist teachers to his court and engaged in lengthy discussions about Buddhist philosophy. He sponsored the construction of new temples and the restoration of old ones. He appointed Buddhist monks to important positions in his administration, but this conversion was not simply political calculation. Many Mongol leaders seemed genuinely attracted to Buddhist teachings about compassion, wisdom, and the interconnectedness of all life. These concepts resonated with traditional Mongol values about social harmony and respect for natural forces. The adoption of Buddhism also facilitated the integration of Mongol rulers into Chinese cultural traditions. Buddhist ceremonies provided frameworks for imperial rituals. Buddhist concepts of universal rulership complemented Mongol ideas about global empire. In the Middle East, the situation was more complex because the region included diverse religious communities. The Ilkhanate ruled over Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. Each group had its own traditions, laws, and institutional structures. Initially, the Mongol rulers maintained the traditional policy of religious tolerance that had been established by Genghis Khan. All faiths were protected as long as their followers remained loyal to the state. Religious leaders received special privileges and exemptions, but over time, practical considerations encouraged conversion to Islam. The vast majority of the Ilkhanate subjects were Muslim. Islamic law provided sophisticated frameworks for governing agricultural and commercial societies. Islamic scholarship offered administrative and intellectual resources that were essential for effective rule. The conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam in 1295 marked the final transformation of Mongol rule in the Middle East. Ghazan became a devout Muslim who promoted Islamic scholarship and sponsored the construction of mosques and madrasas. This conversion was not merely symbolic, it represented a fundamental shift in the character of Mongol rule in the region. Islamic law became the foundation of imperial administration. Arabic and Persian became the primary languages of government. Islamic customs and ceremonies replaced traditional Mongol practices. Christianity played a particularly interesting role in Mongol religious transformation. Many Mongol leaders had Christian wives or mothers, often from Nestorian Christian families that were common in Central Asia. Nestorian Christianity had spread eastward from the Byzantine Empire during earlier centuries. It had established communities throughout Central Asia and had even reached China. Many Nestorian Christians served in important positions within Mongol administration. Some Mongol leaders showed serious interest in converting to Christianity. They invited Christian missionaries to their courts and engaged in theological discussions. They protected Christian communities and sponsored the construction of churches. The most famous example was Sartak, son of Batu Khan of the Golden Horde, who reportedly converted to Christianity. European missionaries hoped that his example might lead to the conversion of other Mongol rulers and the eventual Christianization of the entire empire. But these hopes were ultimately disappointed. Most Mongol leaders who expressed interest in Christianity eventually chose other religious paths that were more compatible with the needs of governing their particular populations. The Golden Horde eventually converted to Islam, following the same pattern as the Ilkhanate. This conversion reflected both the influence of Muslim merchants and scholars in the region and the practical advantages of religious alignment with other Islamic powers. The religious debates that occurred in Mongol courts were remarkable for their openness and intellectual sophistication. Representatives of different faiths were encouraged to present their beliefs and to engage in theological discussions. These debates were often recorded and preserved for future study. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan missionary who visited the court of Munka Khan, described elaborate theological disputations that included Buddhist monks, Islamic scholars, Nestorian Christians, and traditional Mongol shamans. These discussions were conducted with mutual respect and genuine intellectual curiosity. The Mongol commitment to religious tolerance created unique opportunities for interfaith dialogue that would not be equalled in most other medieval societies. Different religious traditions encountered each other in environments where none held dominant political power. This intellectual exchange enriched all the participating traditions. Buddhist scholars learned about Islamic philosophy. Christian theologians studied Chinese texts. Islamic thinkers encountered European ideas. Traditional shamans incorporated concepts from settled religious systems. The conquerors became the converted, adopting the faiths of the conquered. But this transformation was not a sign of weakness or cultural surrender. Instead, it represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between religion and political authority. Mongol leaders recognized that effective governance required more than military force. It required spiritual legitimacy, cultural understanding, and institutional frameworks that commanded popular respect. Religious conversion provided all of these benefits. The religious transformation of the Mongol Empire also demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that had made Mongol expansion possible in the first place. Just as they had learned military techniques from their enemies and administrative methods from their subjects, they learned spiritual wisdom from the religious traditions they encountered. This flexibility allowed the Mongol Empire to survive and prosper long after the period of rapid military expansion had ended. Regional Mongol dynasties continued to rule effectively because they had successfully integrated themselves into the cultural and religious frameworks of their subjects. The legacy of Mongol religious tolerance would influence later Islamic, Chinese, and European societies. The precedent of protecting religious minorities and encouraging interfaith dialogue would be remembered and occasionally revived during subsequent periods of imperial expansion and cultural encounter. The Mongol Empire created the first global network for the exchange of technological innovations and scientific knowledge. Ideas that had been developed in isolation within single civilizations suddenly became available to scholars and craftsmen across 3 continents. This unprecedented sharing of knowledge accelerated human progress in ways that would not be equalled until the modern era. Chinese innovations led this technological revolution. Paper and printing, gunpowder and firearms, the magnetic compass and mechanical clocks. All of these Chinese inventions spread westward along Mongol trade routes with remarkable speed. Paper manufacturing reached the Islamic world first, where it was refined and improved. Islamic papermakers developed better techniques for creating smooth, durable writing surfaces. They also created paper mills that could produce larger quantities more efficiently than Chinese workshops. From the Islamic world, papermaking spread to Europe, where it revolutionized the preservation and transmission of knowledge. European monasteries had previously relied on expensive parchment made from animal skins. Paper was much cheaper and could be produced in much larger quantities. The printing press, invented in China during the Tang dynasty, followed a similar westward journey. Islamic scholars adapted Chinese printing techniques for Arabic script. European craftsmen later developed movable type that could be rearranged for different texts. These innovations made books much cheaper and more widely available. Knowledge that had previously been restricted to small elites became accessible to larger populations. Literacy rates increased throughout Eurasia as books became more affordable. Gunpowder travelled even more quickly along the trade routes. Chinese alchemists had originally developed gunpowder for fireworks and mining operations, but Mongol military engineers quickly recognized its potential as a weapon. Islamic metallurgists improved gunpowder weapons by developing better techniques for casting bronze and iron cannons. They created more effective projectiles and more reliable firing mechanisms. These improvements made gunpowder weapons practical for siege warfare. European engineers made further refinements that eventually revolutionized medieval warfare. They developed portable firearms that individual soldiers could carry and use. They created artillery pieces that could breach the strongest fortifications. The magnetic compass also followed the westward route from China to Europe. Chinese navigators had been using magnetic compasses for centuries to navigate rivers and coastal waters. Arab sailors adapted this technology for ocean navigation in the Indian Ocean. European navigators refined compass technology further and combined it with other navigational instruments. These improvements made long-distance ocean exploration possible and led directly to the European voyages of discovery that would reshape world geography. Mechanical clocks represented another Chinese innovation that was transformed through international exchange. Chinese clockmakers had created sophisticated mechanical timepieces that could track hours, days, and seasons with remarkable accuracy. Islamic scholars studied Chinese clock designs and developed their own improvements. They created clocks that incorporated astronomical calculations and religious observances. These timepieces became essential tools for Islamic worship and scholarship. European clockmakers eventually created the mechanical clocks that would become standard throughout the Western world. These clocks provided the precise timekeeping that was essential for later scientific and industrial development. But technological exchange was not a one-way flow from east to west. Islamic innovations also spread eastward and influenced Chinese and Mongol development. Islamic astronomical instruments reached Chinese observatories, where they improved the accuracy of celestial observations. Islamic mathematical concepts, including algebra and trigonometry, found their way to Chinese scholars who incorporated them into their own mathematical systems. The Arabic numeral system, including the concept of zero, revolutionized Chinese calculations and record-keeping. Medical knowledge flowed in all directions across the Mongol Empire. Chinese physicians shared their understanding of acupuncture and herbal medicine. Islamic doctors contributed their knowledge of surgery and anatomy. Greek and Roman medical texts, preserved in Arabic translation, reached new audiences. This medical exchange had immediate practical benefits. Mongol armies could draw on medical knowledge from across Eurasia to treat wounded soldiers. Civilian populations had access to medical techniques that had been developed in distant civilizations. But medical exchange also had tragic consequences. Disease pathogens spread along trade routes just as readily as beneficial knowledge. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century probably originated in Central Asia and travelled westward along Mongol-protected trade routes. The plague demonstrated how closely connected the Eurasian world had become under Mongol rule. An outbreak in one region could quickly spread to distant continents. This interconnectedness brought both benefits and dangers that previous civilizations had never experienced. Architectural techniques also spread rapidly across the empire. Chinese pagoda designs influenced Islamic minaret construction. Islamic architectural principles affected Chinese palace design. Mongol rulers commissioned buildings that combined architectural elements from multiple traditions. The Yuan dynasty capital at Khanbalik incorporated architectural features from across Eurasia. Chinese construction techniques were combined with Persian decorative elements and Central Asian spatial concepts. The result was a unique architectural synthesis that reflected the international character of Mongol rule. Agricultural innovations spread with equal speed. Chinese techniques for rice cultivation reached new regions where they increased food production. Islamic irrigation methods improved agricultural productivity in previously marginal areas. European plough designs were adapted for different soil conditions across the empire. These agricultural improvements supported larger populations and created the surplus wealth that funded further technological development. Better farming techniques meant that fewer people needed to work in agriculture, freeing more individuals for craft production, trade, and scholarly pursuits. Artistic techniques and materials also flowed freely across the empire. Chinese silk weaving methods reached Islamic textile centers. Islamic geometric design principles influenced Chinese decorative arts. European metalworking techniques were adapted for Asian weapons and tools. This artistic exchange created new styles that combined elements from multiple traditions. Mongol patrons commissioned works that reflected their cosmopolitan tastes and their exposure to different cultural traditions. Ideas travelled the Mongol roads faster than armies ever had. The network of communication and transportation that had been created for military and administrative purposes became the foundation for unprecedented intellectual exchange. Scholars could correspond with colleagues thousands of miles away. Craftsmen could learn techniques that had been developed in distant workshops. Inventors could build on innovations that had been created in completely different civilizations. The technological and scientific exchange fostered by Mongol rule laid the foundation for many later developments in human civilization. The printing press enabled the European Renaissance. Gunpowder weapons changed the nature of warfare. The magnetic compass made global exploration possible. Mechanical clocks provided the precise timekeeping needed for scientific observation. These innovations might eventually have spread without Mongol facilitation, but the process would have been much slower and less systematic. The Mongol Empire compressed centuries of technological diffusion into decades of intensive exchange. The legacy of this remarkable period of innovation sharing would influence human development for centuries to come. The precedent of international scientific cooperation and technological exchange established during the Mongol period would inspire later efforts to create global networks for sharing knowledge and promoting human progress. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 created more than just a succession crisis. It marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how Mongol rulers governed their territories. Nowhere was this change more dramatic than in China, where Kublai Khan would create something entirely new in world history. Kublai had been governing northern China for his brother Mongke when news of the Khan's death reached him. He faced an immediate choice. He could return to Mongolia to participate in selecting the next great Khan, or he could use his position in China to claim supreme power for himself. He chose the path that would change everything. Kublai declared himself Great Khan in 1260, but his younger brother Arik Böke challenged this claim from the traditional Mongol homeland. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years and ended with Kublai's victory. But the conflict had permanent consequences for the empire's unity. The other Khanates had supported different sides in the succession war. They were no longer willing to accept orders from a single supreme ruler. The Mongol Empire was effectively divided into 4 independent states, each going its own way. For Kublai, this division was actually liberating. He no longer needed to balance the demands of traditional Mongol nobles with the needs of governing China. He could focus entirely on becoming the most effective ruler possible for his Chinese subjects. The transformation began with his decision to establish a new capital. Instead of ruling from the traditional Mongol homeland, he built a magnificent city called Khanbalik, where Beijing stands today. This new capital was designed to impress Chinese subjects with Mongol power and sophistication, but the real revolution came in 1271 when Kublai made a decision that shocked traditional Mongols. He formally established the Yuan dynasty and declared himself Emperor of China according to Chinese customs and traditions. He was no longer just a Mongol Khan ruling conquered territories. He was a Chinese emperor claiming the mandate of heaven. This claim required adopting Chinese governmental structures that had evolved over thousands of years. The imperial bureaucracy was based on Confucian principles of administration. The legal system incorporated Chinese laws and customs. The court ceremonies followed Chinese protocols that had been refined for centuries. Kublai surrounded himself with Chinese advisors who understood how to govern agricultural societies. They taught him about tax collection, public works projects, and commercial regulations. They explained the complex relationships between different regions and social classes. The Yuan court became a hybrid institution that blended Mongol and Chinese elements. Mongol military traditions were preserved for ceremonial purposes. Traditional Mongol laws continued to apply to Mongol citizens. But the daily business of governing millions of Chinese people was conducted according to Chinese methods. This adaptation was remarkably successful. Chinese officials who had initially resisted foreign rule gradually came to respect Kublai's administrative abilities. They found him more competent than many previous Chinese emperors had been. Kublai completed the conquest of southern China by defeating the Song dynasty in 1279. This made him the first non-Chinese ruler to control all of China. The achievement required military campaigns that lasted for decades and cost enormous resources. But the Yuan dynasty proved that foreign conquerors could successfully rule Chinese civilization. Kublai created schools throughout his territory. He sponsored artistic projects that combined Chinese and Mongol traditions. He promoted trade and commerce that brought prosperity to all regions. The Yuan dynasty also became a center for international exchange. The Mongol capital attracted visitors from across Eurasia. Merchants, scholars, artists, and diplomats all came to seek opportunities at Kublai's court. Marco Polo's family was among these visitors. They spent years serving Kublai and learning about Chinese civilization. Their later accounts would introduce Europeans to the sophistication of Yuan administration and the wealth of Chinese society. Kublai's transformation extended to his personal life. He adopted Chinese customs while maintaining some Mongol traditions. He studied Chinese philosophy and literature. He patronized Chinese artists and scholars. He became genuinely Chinese in many ways while never forgetting his Mongol heritage. The Yuan dynasty established important precedents for later Chinese history. It proved that foreign dynasties could legitimately rule China if they adopted Chinese governmental methods. It demonstrated that conquest could lead to cultural synthesis rather than just domination. But the transformation also created tensions that would eventually weaken Yuan rule. Traditional Mongols accused Kublai of abandoning his heritage. Chinese subjects sometimes resented foreign rule despite its effectiveness. Regional differences created administrative challenges that were difficult to resolve. The nomad warriors became emperor bureaucrats. This transformation represented one of the most remarkable adaptations in political history. Kublai Khan had successfully reinvented Mongol rule to meet the needs of governing the world's most sophisticated civilization. His success inspired similar adaptations in the other Mongol Khanates. Each region required its own approach to the challenge of governing settled populations, but all would follow Kublai's example of combining nomadic strengths with local administrative traditions. While Kublai Khan was transforming himself into a Chinese emperor, his cousin Hulagu was undergoing a similar metamorphosis in the lands of ancient Persia. The Ilkhanate that Hulagu established would become one of history's great examples of cultural synthesis between conquerors and conquered. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 had eliminated the old center of Islamic civilization. But this destruction created opportunities for new forms of cultural development. Persian cities like Tabriz, Isfahan and Shiraz began to flourish as never before under Mongol patronage. Hulagu and his successors discovered that Persian civilization offered administrative sophistication that could enhance Mongol power. Persian bureaucrats understood how to manage agricultural economies. Persian scholars preserved knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Persian artists created works of beauty that impressed rulers from distant lands. The early Ilkhanate rulers maintained the traditional Mongol policy of religious tolerance. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Zoroastrians all served in the government. This diversity brought different perspectives and skills that strengthened imperial administration. But practical considerations gradually pushed the Ilkhanate toward closer identification with Islamic civilization. The vast majority of their subjects were Muslim. Islamic law provided frameworks for governing commercial and agricultural societies. Islamic scholarship offered intellectual resources that were essential for effective rule. The conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam in 1295 marked the completion of this transformation. Ghazan became a devout Muslim who sponsored mosques, madrasas, and Islamic scholarship. He adopted Persian customs and employed Persian administrators in the highest positions of government. This conversion was not just a personal religious choice. It represented a fundamental shift in the character of Mongol rule in the region. Arabic became the language of religious affairs. Persian became the language of administration and culture. Mongol remained important only for military matters. The Ilkhanate sponsored a remarkable revival of Persian literature and art. Persian poets like Hafez created works that combined traditional Persian themes with new perspectives influenced by Mongol rule. Persian painters developed new styles that incorporated artistic techniques from China and Central Asia. Persian historians like Rashid al-Din wrote comprehensive accounts of world history that drew on sources from across the Mongol Empire. These works preserved knowledge about different civilizations and created new forms of historical scholarship. The architectural achievements of the Ilkhanate were particularly impressive. Persian architects working under Mongol patronage created buildings that combined traditional Islamic designs with new decorative elements. The tomb of Olcaytu in Sultaniye remains one of the masterpieces of Islamic architecture. Persian craftsmen also flourished under Mongol rule. Metalworkers created intricate objects that combined Persian techniques with Mongol symbols. Textile producers wove carpets and fabrics that became prized throughout Eurasia. Ceramic artists developed new glazing techniques that influenced pottery production across the Islamic world. The Ilkhanate became a major center for international trade. Persian merchants established trading relationships with China, India, Europe, and Africa. The wealth generated by this commerce funded the cultural renaissance that made the period famous. Persian gardens reached new heights of sophistication during this period. The famous gardens of Isfahan and Shiraz were expanded and beautified with elaborate water features, exotic plants, and architectural elements that created paradise-like environments. The integration of Mongol rulers into Persian society was so complete that they began to see themselves as Persian shahs rather than Mongol khans. They adopted Persian court ceremonies, Persian dress, and Persian customs. They married into Persian noble families and learned Persian poetry and literature. This cultural transformation had political benefits as well as artistic ones. Persian subjects came to accept Mongol rule because their rulers had genuinely adopted Persian civilization. The foreign dynasty became a Persian dynasty that happened to have Mongol origins. The Ilkhanate also became a bridge between different parts of the Mongol Empire. Persian administrators served in China and Central Asia. Chinese innovations reached Persia and were adapted for local conditions. This cultural exchange enriched all the participating civilizations. Persian scientific achievements during the Ilkhanate period were remarkable. Astronomers working in Persian observatories made accurate calculations of planetary movements. Mathematicians developed new techniques for solving complex problems. Physicians created medical texts that combined Persian, Islamic, Chinese, and Greek knowledge. The period also saw remarkable developments in Persian mystical poetry. Sufi poets like Rumi and Sa'di created works that explored spiritual themes with unprecedented depth and beauty. Their poetry became beloved throughout the Islamic world and influenced religious thought for centuries. North of the Black Sea and west of the Ural Mountains, another Mongol transformation was taking place. The Golden Horde developed a unique approach to ruling settled populations that combined nomadic traditions with tributary relationships. Unlike their cousins in China and Persia, the Khans of the Golden Horde chose not to settle permanently in cities. They maintained their traditional nomadic lifestyle while establishing political control over the Russian principalities and other settled states in their territory. This approach required a different form of administrative adaptation. Instead of directly governing agricultural populations, the Golden Horde developed a system of tributary relationships that allowed local rulers to maintain their traditional authority while acknowledging Mongol supremacy. Russian princes continued to rule their own cities and territories, but they had to travel regularly to the Golden Horde's camp to pay tribute and receive confirmation of their authority. This system ensured Mongol control while minimizing the administrative burden on nomadic rulers. The tribute system became remarkably sophisticated over time. Each Russian principality was assessed based on its population, agricultural productivity, and commercial activity. Tax collectors from the Golden Horde worked with local officials to ensure that obligations were met promptly and completely. This arrangement proved beneficial for both sides. Russian princes gained protection from other threats and access to Mongol trade networks. The Golden Horde received steady revenue without the expense and complexity of direct administration. Cultural exchange flowed in both directions despite the political hierarchy. Russian craftsmen learned metalworking and decorative techniques from Mongol artisans. Mongol nobles adopted certain Russian customs and occasionally married into Russian noble families. The Golden Horde's capital at Sarai became a cosmopolitan city that attracted merchants and scholars from across Eurasia. Russian traders worked alongside Muslim merchants from Central Asia. European diplomats negotiated with Chinese advisors. The city exemplified the international character of Mongol rule. Orthodox Christianity continued to flourish under Mongol protection. The Golden Horde maintained the traditional Mongol policy of religious tolerance. Orthodox churches received special privileges and exemptions. Some Russian metropolitans became influential advisors to Mongol Khans, but the Golden Horde gradually converted to Islam, following the same pattern as the Ilkhanate. This conversion reflected both practical political considerations and genuine spiritual attraction to Islamic teachings. Islamic scholars provided administrative expertise and diplomatic connections with other Muslim states. The conversion process was gradual and never completely uniform. Some Mongol nobles adopted Islam enthusiastically, while others maintained traditional beliefs. Some Russian principalities developed closer relationships with Muslim Khans, while others maintained their distance. Trade relationships became increasingly important as military conquest became less profitable. The Golden Horde controlled key segments of trade routes connecting Europe with Asia. Taxes on this commerce provided steady revenue that supported both nomadic and settled populations. The Horde also facilitated cultural exchange between Western Europe and the Islamic world. European merchants travelling to Asian markets passed through Golden Horde territory. Islamic scholars and artists found opportunities in Russian cities. This exchange enriched both European and Islamic civilizations. Military service remained an important obligation for tributary states. Russian princes were required to provide troops for Golden Horde campaigns. These mixed armies combined Mongol cavalry tactics with Russian infantry capabilities. The cooperation proved effective in conflicts with other European powers. The Golden Horde's approach to governing diverse populations became a model for later empires. The combination of tributary relationships, religious tolerance, and cultural exchange created stability across vast territories with minimal direct administration. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate faced perhaps the most complex challenges of all the Mongol successor states. This region was a crossroads where nomadic and settled peoples, Islamic and Buddhist traditions, Chinese and Persian influences all met and mingled. The territory included ancient Silk Road cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, alongside vast steppes where nomadic tribes continued their traditional way of life. This diversity made unified governmental policies almost impossible to implement effectively. Chagatai and his successors developed a flexible approach that allowed different communities to maintain their traditional practices while acknowledging Mongol authority. Nomadic tribes continued to follow customary law and seasonal migration patterns. Settled cities maintained their commercial and administrative systems. This decentralized approach required constant negotiation and compromise. Nomadic leaders demanded respect for traditional grazing rights. Urban merchants sought protection for trade routes and commercial activities. Religious communities wanted guarantees for their traditional practices. The Chagatai Khans served as mediators between these competing interests rather than imposing uniform policies. They moved constantly between different regions, resolving disputes and maintaining relationships with various local leaders. This mobile governance reflected both nomadic traditions and practical necessities. Religious diversity in the Chagatai territories was particularly complex. Buddhist monasteries from the Chinese cultural sphere operated alongside Islamic mosques and madrasas. Zoroastrian communities maintained their ancient fire temples. Christian churches served Nestorian populations that had lived in the region for centuries. The Khans maintained traditional Mongol religious tolerance, but they also had to navigate the competing claims of different religious communities. Buddhist monks sought imperial patronage for their monasteries. Islamic scholars wanted government support for their schools. Christians requested protection from persecution. Economic activities in the Chagatai Khanate reflected the region's position as a cultural crossroads. Chinese goods flowed westward toward Islamic markets. Persian products travelled eastward toward Chinese consumers. Local craftsmen combined techniques learned from different traditions. The famous carpets and textiles produced in Chagatai territories incorporated design elements from Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian traditions. Metalworkers created objects that combined Islamic geometric patterns with Chinese decorative techniques. These hybrid art forms became highly prized throughout Eurasia. Agriculture in the region required sophisticated irrigation systems that had been developed over centuries. The Mongol rulers learned to maintain these systems while also protecting the grazing areas needed by nomadic herds. This balance required careful coordination between different economic activities. Urban centres like Samarkand became famous for their libraries and schools that preserved knowledge from different civilizations. Scholars working in these institutions had access to texts written in Chinese, Arabic, Persian, and other languages. This multilingual scholarship produced remarkable intellectual achievements. The Chagatai Khanate gradually fragmented into smaller states, as different regions developed their own priorities and interests. Nomadic areas maintained traditional Mongol customs while settled regions adopted local practices. This fragmentation reflected the impossibility of governing such diverse territories from a single centre. Despite this political fragmentation, the region continued to serve as a crucial link between different civilizations. Trade routes remained active. Cultural exchange continued. Artistic traditions evolved through ongoing contact between different peoples and traditions. The Chagatai experience demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Mongol rule. The empire succeeded in creating connections between diverse civilizations and facilitating unprecedented cultural exchange. But it also revealed the practical difficulties of maintaining unity across vast territories with different populations, traditions, and needs. Each of the four khanats had found its own solution to the challenge of governing settled populations. The Yuan dynasty became thoroughly Chinese. The Ilkhanate adopted Persian and Islamic traditions. The Golden Horde developed tributary relationships with European principalities. The Chagatai Khanate maintained flexibility through decentralization. These different approaches all represented successful adaptations of nomadic political traditions to the needs of governing diverse sedentary populations. They demonstrated the remarkable flexibility and learning capacity that had made Mongol expansion possible in the first place. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history. It controlled more territory than any previous empire. It governed more people than any single ruler had ever commanded. It connected civilizations that had never been in direct contact before, but this very success created problems that would ultimately prove impossible to solve. The empire had grown so large that it tested the limits of what was possible with medieval technology and communication systems. Messages from the emperor in Beijing took months to reach governors in Persia or Eastern Europe. By the time orders arrived at distant provinces, the situations they addressed had often changed completely. Local officials had to make important decisions without knowing what their superiors wanted them to do. The Yan postal system, remarkable as it was, could not overcome the basic limitations of distance and time. Even with fresh horses at every station, a message from China to Europe required several months of travel. Emergency communications moved faster, but they still took weeks to cross the empire. This communication delay made coordinated policy almost impossible. When the Khan in Beijing decided to change tax rates, governors in Central Asia might not learn about it for half a year. When rebellions broke out in one region, other areas could not provide assistance quickly enough to matter. Local officials increasingly had to act independently. They made decisions based on their own judgment rather than waiting for instructions from the capital. This independence was necessary for effective governance, but it also weakened imperial unity. Different regions began developing their own approaches to common problems. Chinese administrators used methods that worked well in agricultural societies. Persian officials adopted techniques that were effective in urban commercial centers. Russian governors developed systems that suited their particular populations and circumstances. These regional variations were practical and often successful. But they also created an empire that was becoming less unified over time. Different areas were growing apart rather than growing together. The cultural assimilation that had made Mongol rule successful also created new challenges. As Mongol rulers adopted local customs and religions, they became less distinctively Mongol. They started thinking like Chinese emperors, Persian shahs, or European princes rather than like members of a unified Mongol nation. This cultural transformation was most dramatic among the ruling elites. Kublai Khan had become thoroughly Chinese in most of his attitudes and policies. The Ilkhanate rulers had adopted Persian customs and Islamic beliefs. The Golden Horde Khans were developing their own regional identity. But ordinary Mongol warriors and administrators also began to identify more with their local regions than with the distant empire. A Mongol general serving in Persia might spend decades there, marry a Persian wife, and raise children who spoke Persian as their first language. These personal connections created divided loyalties. Should a Mongol official serve the interests of the great Khan in Beijing? Or should he focus on the welfare of the local population he lived among? The answers were not always the same. Economic pressures also strained imperial unity. The cost of maintaining armies across such vast territories was enormous. The expense of building and maintaining the communication infrastructure was constantly increasing. The administrative bureaucracy required to govern diverse populations grew larger and more expensive every year. Tax collection became increasingly difficult as regional officials developed their own priorities. Money that was supposed to flow to the imperial capital often stayed in local treasuries to fund regional projects. Governors claimed that they needed resources for local defense or development that took priority over imperial obligations. Trade revenues, once a major source of imperial income, began to decline as political instability disrupted commercial networks. Merchants became reluctant to undertake long journeys when they could not be sure of protection throughout their route. The military foundations of Mongol power were also weakening. The army that had conquered the world was no longer the unified force it had once been. Different regions had developed their own military traditions and priorities. Mongol cavalry remained formidable, but other powers had learned from their defeats and developed countermeasures. European knights had adopted new tactics that were more effective against Mongol charges. Chinese armies had incorporated Mongol techniques into their own military systems. More importantly, the Mongols were no longer fighting primarily against external enemies. Much of their military effort was devoted to maintaining control over their own territories and suppressing rebellions among subject populations. The next generation of Mongol leaders faced challenges that their ancestors had never encountered. They had to govern settled populations with different needs and expectations. They had to balance competing regional interests. They had to maintain unity across distances that strained available technology. The traditional Mongol advantages of mobility, unity, and superior military organization were less relevant in this new environment. Success now required diplomatic skills, administrative expertise, and cultural sensitivity that were different from the qualities that had created the empire. The very success of the empire contained the seeds of its dissolution. The territories were too vast to govern from a single centre. The populations were too diverse to satisfy with uniform policies. The distances were too great for effective communication and coordination. Regional autonomy had become necessary for practical governance, but it also meant that central control was weakening. Local interests were becoming more important than imperial unity. The empire was slowly transforming from a unified state into a collection of loosely connected regional powers. In the middle of the 14th century, a catastrophe struck that would transform not just the Mongol Empire, but the entire course of world history. The plague known as the Black Death spread along the same trade routes that had brought prosperity and cultural exchange to Eurasia. The disease probably originated in the grasslands of Central Asia, where it had existed for centuries among wild rodent populations, but changes in climate and trade patterns brought infected animals into closer contact with human settlements. The plague bacteria found new hosts among the rats that lived in cities and travelled with merchant caravans. The disease spread with terrifying speed along the Mongol trade networks. Merchants who seemed healthy when they left one city arrived at their destinations already sick or dead. Ships carried infected rats from port to port across the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Caravans unknowingly transported the plague across the steppes and deserts. The first major outbreak occurred in the territories of the Golden Horde around 1346. Within months, the disease had spread to Mongol territories in Central Asia and Persia. By 1347, it had reached the Mediterranean and begun its devastating march through Europe. The Mongol Empire's greatest achievement, the creation of safe, efficient trade routes connecting different civilizations, became the mechanism for spreading history's most destructive pandemic. The same roads and ships that had carried silk and spices now carried death across 3 continents. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Some regions lost 1/3 of their population within 2 years. Others suffered even higher mortality rates. Entire cities were abandoned when too few people survived to maintain basic services. Rural areas saw farms reverting to wilderness, as there was no one left to work the land. The plague struck different parts of the empire with varying intensity. Urban areas suffered more than rural regions because people lived closer together. Trade centres experienced particularly severe outbreaks because they had more contact with infected travellers. Military camps and administrative centres lost large numbers of their personnel. The economic consequences were equally severe. Trade networks that had operated for decades suddenly collapsed when too few merchants survived to maintain commercial relationships. Agricultural production declined when farmers died or abandoned their fields. Tax revenues fell dramatically as populations shrank. The plague also disrupted the administrative systems that held the empire together. Government officials died at the same rate as ordinary citizens. Records were lost when entire administrative offices were abandoned. Communication systems broke down when there were not enough healthy people to maintain the postal relay stations. Regional authorities found themselves cut off from central coordination just when they most needed guidance and support. Local governors had to deal with unprecedented crises without knowing whether their superiors were even still alive. Some regions went months without any contact with imperial authorities. The military impact was particularly devastating. Mongol armies had always been relatively small forces that achieved their effects through superior organization and mobility. But the plague killed soldiers and horses indiscriminately. Military units that had taken decades to train and equip were destroyed within months. The loss of military capability made it impossible to maintain control over restive populations. Rebellions that might once have been suppressed quickly now continued for months or years. Regional strongmen seized power in areas where imperial authority had collapsed. The psychological impact was perhaps most damaging of all. The Mongol Empire had been built on a reputation for invincibility. Enemies who surrendered quickly were treated well, while those who resisted faced total destruction. This reputation had made conquest easier because most opponents chose submission over resistance. But the plague demonstrated that Mongol power had limits. If the mighty Mongol Empire could not protect its own people from disease, how could it protect anyone else? The aura of invincibility that had been carefully cultivated for over a century began to fade. Religious and cultural tensions that had been suppressed under strong imperial rule began to resurface. Christian populations in some areas blamed their Muslim neighbours for the plague. Traditional rivalries between nomadic and settled peoples erupted into violence. Regional ethnic groups sought independence from foreign rule. The breakdown of the Pax Mongolica had far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate territories of the empire. European kingdoms that had relied on Asian trade for luxury goods found their supply lines disrupted. Chinese industries that had exported products westward lost their markets. The global economy that had emerged during the 13th century began to fragment. Some regions recovered more quickly than others, but none completely escaped the crisis. Areas with stronger local institutions and more diverse economies proved more resilient. Regions that had been entirely dependent on imperial administration and long-distance trade suffered more lasting damage. The plague marked the end of the period of Mongol expansion and consolidation. Never again would the empire be able to project power simultaneously across all its territories. The resources and manpower needed for such coordination had been permanently reduced. As the Mongol Empire weakened, other powers began to emerge that would reshape the political landscape of Eurasia. Some of these were completely new states created by ambitious leaders who seized opportunities during the imperial crisis. Others were older kingdoms that had survived Mongol conquest and were now reasserting their independence. The most significant challenge to Mongol rule came in China, where the Yuan dynasty faced increasing resistance from Chinese populations who had never fully accepted foreign domination. Economic problems caused by the plague, combined with natural disasters and imperial mismanagement, created conditions for widespread rebellion. The Red Turban Rebellion began in the 1350s as a series of local uprisings against Yuan taxation and administration, but it gradually evolved into a coordinated movement aimed at expelling all Mongols from China and restoring native Chinese rule. Zhu Yunzhang, a peasant who had risen to become a rebel leader, proved particularly effective at organizing anti-Mongol resistance. He combined traditional Chinese governmental methods with military innovations learned from the Mongols themselves. His forces used Mongol tactics against Mongol armies. The establishment of the Ming dynasty in 1368 marked the end of nearly a century of Mongol rule in China. The new Chinese emperors were determined to eliminate all traces of foreign influence and to restore traditional Chinese civilization. The Ming forces pursued retreating Mongol armies all the way back to the steppes. They captured the Yuan capital and destroyed many of the palaces and administrative buildings that had symbolized Mongol power. The great experiment in cultural synthesis between nomadic and settled civilizations was ended by force. In Eastern Europe, a different type of resistance was emerging. The Russian principalities that had paid tribute to the Golden Horde for over 2 centuries began to assert their independence as Mongol power weakened. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 marked the beginning of the end for Mongol dominance in Russia. Prince Dmitry of Moscow led a coalition of Russian forces that defeated a Golden Horde army for the first time in generations. Although the Mongols would return and temporarily restore their authority, the psychological impact of the victory was enormous. Ivan the Great of Moscow would complete the liberation process in 1480 by refusing to pay tribute and successfully resisting Mongol attempts at retaliation. The Mongol yoke that had shaped Russian development for centuries was finally broken, but perhaps the most interesting challenge to declining Mongol power came from within the Mongol world itself. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, claimed descent from Genghis Khan and attempted to restore the unified Mongol Empire under his own leadership. Timur's conquests in the late 14th and early 15th centuries covered much of the territory that had once belonged to the Mongol Empire. He conquered Central Asia, Persia, parts of India, and even threatened China. His military methods combined traditional Mongol tactics with new technologies and strategies. The Timurid Empire represented an attempt to revive Mongol power and prestige. Timur claimed to be restoring the empire to its former glory and eliminating the corruption and weakness that had allowed it to decline. He used the same symbols and ceremonies that had been associated with Genghis Khan, but the Timurid restoration was ultimately unsuccessful. The empire was too dependent on Timur's personal leadership and military genius. After his death in 1405, his empire fragmented just as the original Mongol Empire had done a century earlier. Regional successor states began to emerge throughout the former Mongol territories. These new kingdoms combined elements of Mongol governmental methods with local traditions and needs. They preserved some aspects of the Mongol legacy, while adapting to changed circumstances. In Central Asia, various Uzbek and Kazakh Khanats maintained nomadic traditions while governing settled populations. They continued to use the title Khan and claimed legitimacy through descent from Genghis Khan's family, but their actual power was much more limited than that of their imperial ancestors. The Crimean Khanate emerged as the last remnant of Golden Horde power in Eastern Europe, It survived until the 18th century by adapting to changed circumstances and maintaining diplomatic relationships with larger powers like the Ottoman Empire and Russia. In India, the Mughal Empire would later be established by descendants of both Genghis Khan and Timur. The Mughal successfully combined Mongol military traditions with Persian administrative methods and local Indian customs. Their empire would last for several centuries and leave a lasting impact on Indian civilization. These successor states demonstrated both the enduring influence of the Mongol legacy and its adaptation to changing circumstances. The original empire had been too vast and diverse to maintain unity, but its methods and ideas continued to influence political development across Eurasia. The cultural inheritance of the Mongol Empire was perhaps more important than its political legacy. Religious tolerance, merit-based advancement, and international trade connections remained important features of many post-Mongol societies. By the beginning of the 15th century, the great Mongol Empire that had once spanned 3 continents existed only in memory and in small remnant states scattered across Central Asia. The last Khans, who could claim direct descent from Genghis Khan, ruled over territories that were tiny compared to their ancestors' domains. In Mongolia itself, the descendants of the world conquerors had returned to their traditional nomadic lifestyle. They continued to raise horses and sheep on the same grasslands where Genghis Khan had united the tribes 2 centuries earlier, but their political influence had shrunk to match their economic circumstances. The various Mongol tribes that remained in the original homeland maintained their traditional customs and social structures. They still elected Khans according to ancient procedures. They still followed the seasonal migration patterns that had sustained their ancestors for generations. They still remembered the stories of their glorious past. But the world around them had changed dramatically. China was now ruled by the Ming dynasty, which was actively hostile to Mongol interests. Russia had liberated itself from Mongol control and was expanding eastward. The Islamic world had developed new centers of power that no longer acknowledged Mongol authority. The remnant Mongol Khanates in Central Asia faced constant pressure from expanding neighbors. The Uzbek tribes were consolidating their own power in the region. The Ottoman Empire was extending its influence into traditionally Mongol territories. European explorers were finding sea routes that bypassed the old Silk Road entirely. Some Mongol groups attempted to maintain their military traditions by serving as mercenaries for larger powers. Mongol cavalry remained formidable when properly led and equipped, but these warriors were now fighting for foreign rulers rather than for their own imperial ambitions. The great cities that had once served as Mongol capitals fell into decline or were absorbed by other powers. Karakorum, the first Mongol capital, became a minor settlement with no political significance. The magnificent palaces and administrative buildings that had impressed visitors from around the world crumbled into ruins. Trade routes that had once been protected by Mongol authority became dangerous again, as local warlords and bandits replaced imperial administrators. Merchants who had once travelled safely from China to Europe now faced the same hazards that had existed before Mongol unification. The postal system that had been the nervous system of the empire was abandoned, as the cost of maintaining it became prohibitive for the weakened successor states. Communication across Eurasia returned to the slow and unreliable methods that had existed before the Mongol innovations. But the cultural and technological exchanges that the empire had facilitated could not be reversed. Chinese printing technology had reached Europe. Islamic mathematical knowledge had spread to China. Agricultural innovations had been adopted across continents. These achievements became permanent parts of human civilization. The memory of Mongol achievements lived on in the historical records and oral traditions of many peoples. Chinese historians wrote detailed accounts of the Yuan dynasty. Persian chroniclers preserved stories of the Ilkhanate period. European travellers like Marco Polo had recorded their amazement at Mongol achievements. The legal and administrative innovations pioneered by the Mongols influenced later empires and governments. Religious tolerance, merit-based advancement, and international law all had roots in Mongol governmental practices. These ideas would resurface in later centuries when conditions were appropriate for their implementation. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire had demonstrated that it was possible for different civilizations to cooperate and learn from each other. The period of cultural exchange and technological sharing that had occurred during the height of Mongol power provided a model for international relations that would inspire later generations. The empire that had once spanned continents retreated to its original steps. The great experiment in global governance had ended, but the precedents it established and the connections it created continued to influence human development long after the last Khan had lost his power. In the quiet grasslands of Mongolia, where herders still followed their flocks under the eternal blue sky, the descendants of Genghis Khan continued their traditional way of life. They remembered the stories of their ancestors' great achievements. They preserved the customs and values that had once conquered the world. The age of Mongol dominance had passed. New powers were rising to shape the future of human civilization. But the legacy of the great empire would endure, woven into the fabric of world history like threads in an ancient tapestry. The nomads who had briefly united the known world had returned to their ancestral homeland. Their moment of global influence had ended, but they had changed the course of human history in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. As we look back across the centuries at what the Mongols accomplished, the scale of their achievement remains almost impossible to comprehend. In less than 100 years, they created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Their territories stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the tropical regions of Southeast Asia. No empire before or since has controlled such vast territories or governed so many different peoples. The Roman Empire, impressive as it was, covered only a fraction of the territory that the Mongols ruled. The British Empire, though it spanned the globe, was never a unified landmass under direct control from a single capital. The Mongols accomplished this expansion with relatively small armies. Their success came not from overwhelming numbers, but from superior organization, communication, and tactics. They proved that intelligence and coordination could triumph over much larger but poorly organized forces. But conquest was only the beginning of their achievement. The administrative innovations they developed allowed them to govern diverse populations across enormous distances. The decimal system of military and civil organization provided clear chains of command that could function efficiently even when communication was slow and difficult. The Yam postal system they created was centuries ahead of anything that existed elsewhere in the world. Messages and goods could travel from China to Europe with unprecedented speed and security. This communication network made possible the coordination of activities across distances that had previously been unimaginable. Perhaps most remarkably, the Mongols created the world's first truly multicultural empire. They governed Chinese farmers and European knights, Islamic merchants and Buddhist monks, all within the same political framework. They proved that people from completely different backgrounds could work together for common purposes. Their policy of religious tolerance was revolutionary for its time. While other medieval rulers persecuted religious minorities, the Mongols protected all faiths and encouraged dialogue between different traditions. They understood that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness. The meritocracy they established gave opportunities to talented individuals regardless of their birth, ethnicity, or religion. A peasant could rise to high government office if he demonstrated ability and loyalty. This system attracted the best minds from across their territories and created unprecedented social mobility. The cultural and technological exchange they facilitated transformed human civilization. Ideas that had been isolated in single societies suddenly spread across continents. Chinese innovations reached Europe. Islamic scholarship influenced China. European techniques found their way to Asia. This exchange accelerated human progress in ways that affected every aspect of life. The Mongols also established precedents for international law and diplomacy that influenced later developments. Their treaties and diplomatic practices created standards for relations between different states. Their commercial regulations facilitated trade on a global scale. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the world could function as a single economic and cultural system. For the first time in history, Goods, ideas, and people moved freely across the largest possible distances. They created a prototype for globalization that would not be equalled again for many centuries. But these remarkable achievements came at an enormous cost in human suffering and cultural destruction. The Mongol conquests were among the most devastating military campaigns in human history. Entire populations were eliminated. Ancient cities were reduced to rubble. Civilizations that had flourished for centuries were erased in a matter of years. The demographic impact was staggering. Some regions lost half their population during the initial conquests. Others never fully recovered from the destruction even generations later. The human cost of Mongol expansion can never be precisely calculated, but it's certainly numbered in the millions of deaths. Cities that had been centers of learning and culture for centuries were completely destroyed. Baghdad, once the jewel of Islamic civilization, was left largely uninhabited after the Mongol conquest. Samarkand, Kiev, and dozens of other great cities suffered similar fates. The knowledge contained in their libraries, the art housed in their palaces, and the skills of their craftsmen were lost forever. The psychological trauma inflicted on conquered populations was equally severe. The Mongol policy of using terror as a weapon created fear that lasted for generations. Communities that had survived the initial conquests lived in constant anxiety about future attacks. This fear paralyzed economic and cultural development in many regions. Agricultural systems that had sustained civilizations for millennia were deliberately destroyed as instruments of war. Irrigation networks in Persia and Central Asia were broken to deny resources to enemies. Fertile farmlands were turned into grazing grounds for Mongol horses. The environmental damage from these policies affected some regions for centuries. The disruption of established social and political systems created chaos that lasted long after the fighting ended. Traditional forms of government were eliminated without being replaced by equally effective alternatives. Legal systems were overturned without adequate substitutes being provided. Social hierarchies were destroyed without consideration for the consequences. Many conquered peoples lost their cultural identity under Mongol rule. Languages disappeared when their speakers were killed or scattered. Religious practices were abandoned when communities were destroyed. Artistic traditions ended when there was no one left to continue them. The long-term consequences of Mongol conquest continued to affect some regions for centuries. Areas that had been prosperous and densely populated before the Mongol invasions remained underdeveloped long after Mongol power had declined. Recovery was slow and often incomplete. The plague that spread along Mongol trade routes in the 14th century was partly a consequence of the connections they had created. The same networks that facilitated beneficial exchange also allowed deadly diseases to spread more quickly and widely than ever before. Despite the enormous costs of their conquests, the Mongols left a lasting positive legacy that continues to influence the modern world. Many of today's nation-states have borders that were originally established during the period of Mongol rule. The boundaries between China and Russia, between Central Asian republics, and between Middle Eastern countries all reflect decisions made by Mongol administrators centuries ago. The cultural synthesis that occurred under Mongol rule created hybrid civilizations that combined elements from different traditions. Persian literature was enriched by Chinese influences. Chinese art incorporated Islamic motifs. European technology was improved through contact with Asian innovations. These cultural fusions became permanent parts of human civilization. Technological and scientific advancement accelerated dramatically during the period of Mongol rule. The exchange of knowledge between different civilizations led to innovations that might not have occurred for centuries under other circumstances. Printing, gunpowder, navigation instruments, and mechanical clocks all spread more rapidly because of Mongol connections. The precedent for globalization established by the Mongol Empire influenced later attempts at international cooperation. The idea that different peoples could work together for mutual benefit, that trade could be conducted safely across vast distances, and that cultural exchange could enrich all participants. These concepts became part of human political thinking. Modern international law and diplomacy owe much to Mongol innovations. Concepts like diplomatic immunity, treaty obligations, and commercial regulations were first developed on a global scale during the Mongol period. These legal frameworks provided foundations that later empires and international organizations would build upon. The Mongol example of religious tolerance influenced later political thinkers who were seeking alternatives to religious persecution and warfare. The idea that different faiths could coexist peacefully within the same political system was revolutionary for its time and remains relevant today. The principle of advancement based on merit rather than birth became an important element in later governmental systems. The Mongol demonstration that talent could be found among all peoples and social classes influenced the development of more egalitarian societies. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols proved that it was possible for different civilizations to learn from each other and to cooperate for common purposes. Their empire showed what could be achieved when barriers between peoples were removed and when diversity was seen as an asset rather than a threat. The memory of Mongol achievements continued to inspire later conquerors and empire builders. Napoleon studied their military tactics. Modern military strategists still analyze their campaigns. Political leaders seeking to unite diverse populations often look to Mongol examples. In our modern globalized world, we are in many ways the heirs to the Mongol legacy. International trade, cultural exchange, technological sharing, and diplomatic cooperation all have roots in the precedents established during the Mongol period. The challenges we face in managing cultural diversity and international relations are similar to those the Mongols encountered and sometimes successfully addressed. The Great Mongol Empire lasted only a few centuries, but its influence on human civilization has been permanent. It demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of global integration. It showed what could be achieved through cooperation between different peoples, but also revealed the costs of conquest and cultural destruction. The lessons of Mongol history remain relevant for anyone seeking to understand how diverse societies can work together while preserving their individual identities and values. As we reach the end of our journey through the Mongol Empire, we find ourselves contemplating one of history's greatest paradoxes. An empire built on conquest became a conduit for peace. Nomads who knew no fixed home created the world's first global civilization. Warriors who destroyed cities became patrons of art and learning. Think about this remarkable transformation. Men who had grown up sleeping in felt tents on windswept grasslands learned to govern sophisticated cities with millions of inhabitants. Hunters who had tracked deer across empty steppes learned to navigate the complex relationships between different religions, cultures, and civilizations. The Mongol story reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary change and growth. The same people who could be utterly ruthless in warfare could also show unprecedented tolerance and wisdom in governance. They proved that we are not prisoners of our circumstances or our cultural backgrounds. Their empire rose and fell like all empires do, but something deeper remains. They showed us what becomes possible when barriers between peoples are removed, when ideas flow freely across continents, when different traditions learn from each other instead of fighting. In their courts, Chinese scholars debated with Persian philosophers. Christian monks discussed theology with Buddhist teachers. Islamic scientists shared their discoveries with European visitors. For a brief moment in history, the human family glimpsed what it might look like to truly live as one people under the same sky. The Mongols understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern world. Strength comes from unity, but unity does not require uniformity. A single empire could embrace countless different ways of life, different beliefs, different customs. Diversity was not a weakness to be eliminated, but a source of richness to be celebrated. Their trade routes connected not just markets, but hearts and minds. A merchant from Venice could find friendship in the court of a Chinese emperor. A Persian poet could inspire artists in distant Mongolia. A Chinese invention could solve problems in European workshops. The world was truly one marketplace, one community, one human family. When we look up at the night sky, we see the same stars that guided Mongol horsemen across the steppes 8 centuries ago. We feel the same wind that filled their sails and stirred their banners. We share the same hopes for peace, prosperity and connection that motivated their greatest achievements. The Mongol Empire fell because it grew too large for the technology and communication systems of its time, but we live in an age when instant communication spans the globe, when ideas travel faster than Mongol horses ever could, when the dream of human connection and cooperation is more achievable than ever before. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Mongol Empire is that our differences need not divide us, that people from completely different backgrounds can work together for common purposes, that the barriers between cultures are often smaller than they appear. In our modern global civilization, we are perhaps the heirs not just to their conquests, but to their impossible dream. The dream of making the entire world a single community under the eternal blue sky, a place where knowledge flows freely, where trade connects distant peoples, where different traditions enrich rather than threaten each other. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander across those ancient grasslands. Feel the rhythm of horses galloping across endless plains. Hear the wind singing through the grass. See the vast sky stretching from horizon to horizon, connecting all lands and all peoples under its infinite embrace. The Mongol Empire taught us that extraordinary things become possible when human beings dare to dream beyond the boundaries of their small worlds. Their legacy lives on not in monuments of stone, but in the continuing human quest for connection, understanding, and peace. Rest now and dream of that eternal sky that arches over us all.